Somewhere in the back of your memory, there is a sound. A low, warm crackle of old radio static. A brass band drifting lazily through frequencies that feel like they belong to a different century. A voice cutting through, smooth and unhurried, telling you that war never changes. And then the world opens up, vast and orange and broken and beautiful, stretching out in every direction under a sky that has not been blue in 200 years. That is the Fallout universe. And once it gets into you, it never really leaves. Tonight we are going to sit with that world for a while. We are going to move through it the way you would walk through a ruined neighborhood at dusk, slowly, stopping at every doorway, reading every scrap of paper on the floor, listening at every cracked terminal screen. Because the Fallout universe is not just a setting, it is a puzzle box inside a puzzle box, wrapped in a layer of 1950s optimism and filled with 200 years of accumulated darkness, complexity, secret history, and the specific kind of melancholy that comes from realizing that the thing you thought was protecting you was never protecting you at all. The further in you go, the stranger and more compelling it becomes. There are layers in this world that most players never reach. Stories that require you to read between the lines of terminal entries and holotapes, theories that the developers built deliberately into the negative space of the lore. Some of the most important things in this universe are never said out loud. They are implied, suggested, left in the corner of a burned room for someone patient enough to find them. So get comfortable. Let the light go low. We are going in. Part 1. The world that never was alternate America and the long road to ruin. The first thing you need to understand about Fallout's world is that it is not our world wearing a costume. It is not a version of Earth where someone just added radiation and wasteland aesthetics on top of the familiar modern world. It is a genuinely different timeline, one that split from our own history at some point in the years immediately following the Second World War, and then developed across the following century in ways that are simultaneously more optimistic in their surface presentation and far more catastrophic in their underlying trajectory than anything we actually experienced. In our world, the transistor arrived in 1947. Bell Laboratories, 3 engineers, a small slab of germanium. That invention changed everything. Electronics shrank. Computers went from room-sized calculating engines to desk-sized tools to devices you carry in your pocket. Communication became instantaneous. The shape of culture changed with technology, decade by decade. The 60s and their upheaval, the 70s and their disillusionment, the digital revolutions of later decades, all of it made possible by silicon chips getting smaller and faster and cheaper every few years. In the Fallout universe, that did not happen. The transistor either never arrived or never caught on in the same way. The dominant technology of that world went in a different direction entirely, doubling down on atomic power as the primary energy source and driver of technological progress. The atom was the future, not silicon. Not semiconductors, the nucleus of the atom, cracked open and harvested for its energy, powering everything from household appliances to automobiles to the massive industrial processes that built the infrastructure of mid-century American prosperity. And the cultural moment that accompanied the rise of atomic technology, the chrome and the curves and the bouffant hairstyles, the diners and the drive-ins and the cheerful, slightly aggressive optimism of post-war American life, all of that froze in place. It did not evolve. There was no 1960s counterculture because there was no Vietnam War in the way we experienced it, no generational disillusionment with government authority, no mass media capable of broadcasting dissent at the speed that television actually enabled in our world. The culture of Fallout's America is essentially 1958, and it stayed that way, becoming more elaborate and more technologically sophisticated, but not culturally different, all the way to the moment when the bombs fell on October 23rd, 2077. Think about what that means in practical terms. Over 130 years of frozen aesthetic, 130 years of the same advertising language, the same graphic design sensibility, the same civic boosters telling you that tomorrow would be even better than today. Nuka-Cola and its dozens of flavors. Vim, the competing brand from Maine. Abraxo Cleaner. Handy Pack. Sunset Sarsaparilla from the Southwest. These are not nostalgic brands that someone dusted off for retro appeal. These are companies that genuinely did not need to change, because the world around them never demanded it. When you find a Nuka-Cola vending machine in the Commonwealth or the Capital Wasteland, and it still has bottles of perfectly preserved quantum inside it, glowing their characteristic electric blue, you are not looking at a museum exhibit. You are looking at a product that was in active production and distribution right up until the morning the world ended. The technology itself grew in remarkable ways within that frozen cultural moment. Fusion power became the backbone of daily energy consumption. Automobiles ran on miniaturized fusion cells that could theoretically run for a century before needing replacement. Robotic assistants became sophisticated enough to run households, care for children, manage retail operations, and perform complex manufacturing tasks. The Mr. Handy model, with its cheerful British accent and its rotating array of manipulator arms, became the aspirational household appliance of the mid-21st century in the same way that certain consumer electronics became aspirational items in our own timeline. Personal computer terminals proliferated across businesses and government offices. Medical technology advanced to the point where cryogenic suspension was not merely experimental, but available as a commercial service to the wealthy. Military technology made even more dramatic leaps. Laser rifles, plasma weapons that fired superheated bolts of ionized gas capable of vaporizing most materials, miniguns and missile launchers designed with a robustness that let them function reliably after 2 centuries of exposure to radiation and neglect. And above all, the power armor, the great technological achievement of the pre-war military, self-contained suits of articulated armor plating powered by fusion cores, capable of making a single soldier functionally invulnerable to most conventional weapons and strong enough to lift and throw a car. The development of power armor transformed military doctrine in ways that echoed through the entire late pre-war period and, after the bombs fell, made the technology one of the most sought-after assets in the wasteland. But all of this technological achievement existed alongside that frozen cultural aesthetic, and the combination created something genuinely strange, a world that looks simultaneously more advanced and more nostalgic than anything in our own history. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal computing device that every Vault dweller receives as standard equipment, is styled to look like something from the 1950s, even though its capabilities would have been impossible for actual 1950s technology to produce. The power armor has the silhouette of a science fiction magazine cover from the same era. The nuclear-powered cars parked on every pre-war street look like the dream automobiles of 1950s concept art, all fins and curves and gleaming chrome, just with miniature fusion reactors instead of gasoline engines. The propaganda posters retained the cheerful, slightly menacing visual language of wartime messaging, even as the wars themselves became more complex and more morally ambiguous. Government communications spoke in the voice of civic optimism long after the actual civic situation had become desperate. The Vault-Tec advertisements, which players encounter scattered across terminals and billboards and brochures throughout the games, are perhaps the purest expression of this quality. Friendly, rounded fonts, bright illustrations of smiling families in matching jumpsuits, language that is relentlessly positive about the future, all presented with a graphic sensibility that has not updated since the Eisenhower administration. They are perfect advertisements. They are also completely false. And understanding why they are false is essential to understanding how the Fallout universe actually works. By the middle of the 21st century, the world's oil reserves were approaching exhaustion, not the gradual, debatable depletion that characterized energy policy debates in our own timeline, but a concrete, measurable decline that was clearly approaching a crisis point within years rather than decades. The resource wars that followed, which began formally around 2052, sent the major powers into increasingly desperate competition for the remaining fossil fuel deposits. Europe fractured into competing national interests, fighting over Middle Eastern reserves. The Arab states, caught between competing external powers, collectively collapsed under the pressure. China, facing enormous domestic energy demands and a growing military apparatus that required reliable fuel, invaded Alaska in 2066 to seize control of American oil reserves in the Prudhoe Bay region. The United States responded with the Anchorage Reclamation. This was not a minor military operation, but a full-scale mobilization, employing the most advanced weapons technology available, including the newest generation of power armor models and experimental energy weapons developed by companies like Vault-Tec. Decades of military spending had produced genuinely extraordinary weapon systems, and the Anchorage campaign became the proving ground for much of it. The operation is recreated in harrowing detail in Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage downloadable content, where the player experiences a military virtual reality training simulation based on the actual events. And even within the compressed and gamified format of a training simulation, the brutal character of the campaign comes through clearly. American forces eventually pushed Chinese troops out of Alaska, an outcome that the United States government presented as a triumphant victory in the resource war. But the victory did not end the underlying conflict. The Sino-American War ground on for years afterward, both sides too deeply committed and too economically dependent on the war economy to seek a settlement. American soldiers fought on the Chinese mainland and in Alaska, and both fronts became grinding stalemates that consumed resources, personnel, and public morale without producing decisive results. The psychological toll on returning veterans was severe. The economic strain on the American government was enormous, and in the background of the public-facing war narrative, certain organizations were quietly preparing for a scenario that had stopped being unthinkable. One of those organizations was a corporation called Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec had existed for decades as a general technology and engineering company before receiving what would become its most significant contract, a commission from the United States government to design and construct a network of underground shelters designated for the protection of American civilians in the event of nuclear war. This project was officially called Project Safe House, and it broke ground in 2054 with the construction of a proof-of-concept vault beneath Los Angeles. Over the following years, Vault-Tec constructed 122 of these facilities scattered across the continental United States. Each was a massive underground complex built to house 1,000 occupants, stocked with food, water purification systems, hydroponic bays, medical facilities, workshops, and the full spectrum of infrastructure a self-contained community would need to maintain itself over an extended period. The advertising campaign for the vaults was remarkable. Glossy promotional materials showed smiling families in color-coordinated jumpsuits, stepping confidently through gleaming vault doors into bright, clean corridors. Cheerful Mr. Handy robots assisted with luggage and offered helpful information. The interior spaces depicted in the brochures looked comfortable and modern, nothing like the institutional facilities they actually were. Vault-Tec representatives knocked on doors across America, offering spaces in upcoming lottery selections. Government public service announcements encouraged citizens to register for vault consideration. The message was consistent and comprehensive. When the worst happened, the responsible, forward-thinking American would be ready. The vault was the answer. Vault-Tec was the company that would protect your family. Almost none of it was true. And the gap between the advertising and the reality is the darkness at the center of the Fallout universe's premise. Robert Edwin House, the visionary, brilliantly eccentric CEO of Robco Industries, was one of the few people who had a reasonably accurate picture of what was coming and the resources to do something about it. House had founded Robco at 22, built it into a technology empire through a combination of genuine invention and exceptional business acumen, and by the mid-21st century was one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the United States. His Pip-Boy devices were ubiquitous. His Protectron robots populated workplaces and government facilities. His Securitron combat robots had been contracted to various military and law enforcement applications. But House's real distinction was as a predictor. He had built a suite of algorithms designed to model complex geopolitical systems, and those algorithms, run against the accumulated data of the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict and the declining oil situation, produced a conclusion that House reached sometime in the 1980s. Nuclear war was not a possibility but a probability, a near certainty within the century. He ran the numbers repeatedly, adjusted his variables, updated his inputs as new information became available, and the result was always the same. The world was going to burn. He began preparing. He invested heavily in defensive technology for Las Vegas, which he had decided was the city worth saving, both because of its personal significance to him and because of its unique position in the American Southwest as a relatively isolated population center with defensible geography and existing infrastructure. He worked with the government on missile defense installations. He commissioned a vast subterranean server complex beneath the Lucky 38 casino. He developed and deployed an army of Securitron robots, programmed and armed, positioned throughout the city. He arranged a life support system that could maintain him in a state of minimal biological function while his consciousness ran on the server architecture, allowing him to effectively hibernate while his city waited. His calculation gave him an expected date for the war, October 22nd, 2077. He was off by 1 day. The actual date was October 23rd, and that single day of discrepancy meant his defense grid came online fractionally later than planned, and his Securitron army reached only a fraction of the full operational status he had intended. The consequences of that imprecision were significant. 63 nuclear missiles targeted Las Vegas. His systems intercepted 54 of them. 9 got through. 9 nuclear warheads. In a city of several 100,000 people, the damage was immense. Las Vegas burned in patches. But the iconic Strip, the central corridor of casinos and hotels, and the infrastructure House had specifically prioritized, survived largely intact. It was an extraordinary outcome, the product of decades of planning and enormous expenditure, and it was simultaneously a tremendous success and a catastrophic near miss. 9 missiles where he had planned for 0. House went into his long sleep carrying that knowledge. Thank you for being here tonight. Wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing where these things end up. And if you are not subscribed yet, the button is right there. It helps enormously, and it costs you nothing. Part 2. The Architecture of Deception, Vault-Tec's True Purpose, and the Experiment Network. The official story of the vaults, the story that was told to the public and printed in the brochures and narrated in the public service announcements, was that they were survival shelters, underground sanctuaries where selected American citizens could wait out a nuclear war and emerge, when conditions on the surface normalized, to begin the process of rebuilding society. Simple, reasonable, defensible. The sort of thing a responsible government and a trustworthy corporation might actually do in the face of an existential threat. The real purpose was something else entirely. The true function of the Vault Network was not revealed to players in any single moment of dramatic exposition. It was assembled over years of gameplay across multiple entries in the franchise, through the accumulation of terminal entries and holotapes and recovered documents, and the occasional character willing to speak plainly about what they know. What those assembled sources describe is one of the most methodically conceived institutional deceptions in the franchise's history, and one of the most disturbing, because it was not the product of chaos or accident, but of careful planning, deliberate choice, and the shared conviction of a small group of people that the suffering of everyone else was an acceptable cost for the information they wanted to gather. The background is the Enclave. The Enclave is a remnant of the United States government, specifically the elements of the executive branch and the military-industrial apparatus that had prepared for nuclear war not by building public shelters, but by evacuating themselves to hardened private facilities. An oil rig off the Pacific coast, military bunkers, and various other secured locations. The Enclave considered itself, sincerely and consistently, the legitimate continuation of the United States of America. They had the institutional continuity. They had the legal authority, in their own assessment. They had the technology and the resources to support that claim. What they did not have, by the post-war period, was a viable plan for what came next. The Enclave's long-term goal, established in their planning before the war, was to eventually return to the surface and reassert American governmental authority over the wasteland. The problem was that 200 years of exposure to radiation and mutagen had left the surface population, in the Enclave's assessment, too contaminated to be the citizens of a restored America. The wasteland's people were not seen as fellow survivors to be assisted, but as a permanently compromised population to be eventually replaced. The Enclave's intention, clearly articulated in recovered documents from Fallout 2 onward, was to use the scientific and military advantages of their isolation to develop the means to cleanse the surface and then repopulate it with their own genetically clean population. Getting to that point required information. Specifically, it required data on how human populations behaved under extreme stress over very long periods of time. If the Enclave were eventually going to reestablish civilization, they needed to understand the dynamics of isolated communities, the effects of resource scarcity on social structure, the psychological impact of authority and its absence, the variables that produced cooperation versus conflict, the biological effects of various environmental stressors on human physiology, the kind of data that cannot be ethically gathered from real human subjects, and that the Enclave intended to gather from real human subjects anyway. The vaults, designed and built by Vault-Tec under a government contract that was itself an enclave project, were the mechanism. 122 sealed environments, each containing 1,000 involuntary test subjects. Each experiment was designed to produce specific data. Each population was sealed in without informed consent, without knowledge of the experiment being conducted on them, without recourse when the conditions of the experiment became unbearable. The cheerful, rounded logo of Vault-Tec was, ultimately, the face of an organization that had decided to turn the apocalypse into a laboratory. The range of experiments across the Vault network is vast enough that it reads almost like a catalog of human vulnerability, each entry testing a different axis of the question, what will people do, and what will people become? Under the right conditions? Vault 101 in the capital wasteland was the never-open experiment. Every other vault in the network was designed to eventually open, either when a predetermined period had elapsed or when the automated systems received a signal from Vault-Tec Authority indicating it was safe to release the population. Vault 101 was different. The vault's overseer was given explicit instructions that the doors were never to be opened, not temporarily, not for maintenance, not in any circumstances. The vault was stocked with the specific equipment and spare parts needed to maintain indefinite operation, because the experiment required permanence. The vault would never open, and the population would live and die inside it, generation after generation, in the belief that the outside world was inaccessible. The experiment was actually two experiments, which is characteristic of Vault-Tec's approach to efficiency. The surface experiment was the straightforward one. What happens to a society that believes there is no outside world? The deeper experiment was about the overseer role. The vault was designed to test what authority looks like when it is absolute and hereditary, when the overseer is not just an administrator, but the literal gatekeeper of survival itself, when the question of who controls the vault entrance is the same as the question of who controls life and death. Over multiple generations, the overseer position in Vault 101 became something close to theocratic, and the community that grew up around it had a specific, rigid social structure built around that central power dynamic. When the protagonist of Fallout 3 emerges from Vault 101 as a young adult chasing their escaped father, they step into a world that the Vault community, after more than 200 years, still genuinely believes is lethal and unreachable. The outside world exists, obviously, and people live in it, and it is hard and dangerous but survivable. The Vault community does not know this. They have been told, generation after generation, that the surface is death, and the Overseer's control of the Vault door makes that belief the central fact of their social existence. Vault 29, detailed in the Fallout Bible and referenced in Fallout 76, took a different and uniquely cruel approach to population selection. This vault accepted only children under the age of 15, deliberately separating families. The parents who submitted their children were told they would be reunited with their families in adjacent sections of the facility. They were not. The children went in. The adults were not admitted. Inside the vault, a single ZAC supercomputer designated ZAX 1.2 was the sole authority, tasked with raising the child population according to a specific developmental protocol. The experiment was about what human children develop into when adult authority is provided entirely by a machine rather than by other humans, when their social formation happens in an environment shaped exclusively by algorithmic decision-making. The results, from the limited records available, suggest that the experiment produced exactly the kind of psychological damage you would expect from an environment where every authority figure is fundamentally incapable of genuine empathy. Vault 92 was the musician vault. It was built and populated with the stated purpose of preserving musical culture, of ensuring that post-war civilization would have access to trained musicians and preserved musical knowledge. The residents were all professional musicians or serious students of music, classically trained instrumentalists, composers, vocalists, sound engineers. The vault was designed with excellent acoustics and multiple rehearsal spaces and an extensive library of musical scores and recordings. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was advertised as, a cultural preservation project, a recognition that music was worth protecting alongside physical survival infrastructure. The secondary experiment was embedded in the vault's environmental systems. White noise broadcasts were scheduled to play through the living areas at irregular intervals, and those broadcasts were specifically calibrated to trigger psychotic episodes in a statistically predictable proportion of the population. The residents would not know they were experiencing an externally induced psychological event. They would experience it as internal, as their own minds turning on them, and the effect on the community would be observed and documented by the automated systems. What happened in Vault 92 was that the community slowly developed a persistent, low-level paranoia about each other because violent episodes kept occurring that no one could explain and everyone experienced as random and unpredictable because they were. Musicians, who spend enormous amounts of time in close proximity in high-stress creative environments, were pushed to their breaking point by a system designed to see what that breaking point looked like. The terminal entries recovered from Vault 92 and Fallout 3 are among the most emotionally difficult in the franchise. They document a community trying to maintain artistic culture while simultaneously managing a violence problem that keeps getting worse, a problem they attribute to the personalities of individual members rather than to the systematic process destroying them from within. The gap between what the people writing those entries believed about their situation and what was actually happening to them is heartbreaking, in a way that does not require elaborate storytelling to deliver. The facts are enough. But of all the Vault experiments in the New Vegas region, Vault 11 is the one that has been most discussed and analyzed by the community, and for good reason. It is a masterclass in the design of a moral trap. The Vault's population was told, at the moment of entry and repeatedly thereafter, that one person from their number must be sacrificed each year. The sacrifice was to be selected by democratic vote. The threat attached to non-compliance was specific. If no one was sacrificed in a given year, 5 members of the Vault would be selected at random and executed by the automated systems. 1 life to prevent 5 deaths. A simple utilitarian calculation, presented as a civic responsibility. The vote was implemented. Every year, without exception, the Vault held its election. Over generations, the residents developed elaborate political systems around the annual selection, networks of alliance and obligation and blackmail, factions that formed around the question of who should be offered up next. A class of people emerged who were essentially professional sacrifice brokers, individuals who collected debts and favors that could be converted into sacrifice immunity. The annual vote became the central political event of Vault life, the axis around which everything else organized. What the residents of Vault 11 were never told was that the Vault's automated systems contained a failsafe that directly contradicted the stated terms. If the residents ever voted collectively to refuse the sacrifice, if they went to the terminal and entered no one, the computer's actual response would have been to open the Vault door. Not to execute 5 random people, to let them out. The entire architecture of the annual vote, the threat, the compliance, the political machinery that grew up around it, was built on a lie about what would happen if they stopped complying. They did eventually stop. A small group, after generations of participation in the system, decided that they would not name anyone. They walked to the sacrifice terminal together and refused. The automated response was not the failsafe. The automated response was security robots, which killed everyone they found. The failsafe had apparently failed, or had been designed with a more conditional trigger than the simple act of refusal. 5 people survived by hiding during the robot response. They made it out of the Vault. The terminal entries those 5 survivors left behind, recovered by the player in Fallout New Vegas, are brief and devastating. They survived the Vault only to find the wasteland, and none of them lasted long out there. The experiment produced its data point. Yes, given the right conditions, a community will sacrifice its members indefinitely, will build a culture around the practice, will develop the ideology to justify it, and when collective resistance finally comes, it comes too late and from too few people, and the mechanisms of the system they were resisting are no longer functioning as designed. There is something in the structure of Vault 11's experiment that goes beyond dark creativity and into something that reads like a philosophical position. The people who designed it understood human behavior well enough to predict that the Vault's population would participate and would continue to participate and would eventually resist, and that the resistance would be too late. They built the experiment knowing how it would end, and then they sealed 1,000 people inside it and moved on to the next design. Part 3. The experiments continue more Vault stories and their specific horrors. The Vault Network's individual experiments range in their awfulness from the merely terrible to the genuinely monstrous, And it is worth spending time with the specific ones that have left the deepest marks on players who have encountered them. Vault 108, in the capital wasteland south of Canterbury Commons, is not technically a complex experiment. It was set up as a cloning study, with a single functional cloning apparatus and a standard vault population. The experiment, such as it was, appears to have been relatively simple in its design. Observe the social and ethical implications of human cloning in a closed environment. What happened instead was what happens when you give one person in a closed system a significant technological advantage over everyone else. One of the vault residents, a man named Gary, was cloned. Then cloned again, then again. The Gary clones turned out to be aggressive and psychotic, a trait that may or may not have been inherent to the original Gary's personality or may have been introduced through the cloning process itself, the quality control on human cloning in the mid-21st century being apparently imperfect. The Gary clones outnumbered the rest of the Vault population. They turned on everyone else. They turned on each other. By the time the Vault story reached its endpoint, the entire facility was populated exclusively by Gary clones, all of them homicidal, all of them capable of communicating in exactly one word, which was their own name. The player encounters Vault 108 in Fallout 3, and the sound design of the experience is something that tends to stay with people. The Gary clones are not quiet. They call out from the darkness as you walk through the corridors, variations on their single-word vocabulary producing a surprisingly wide emotional range. There is something in hearing just one word repeated from every direction that bypasses the rational response to game enemies and lands somewhere more instinctive, more wrong-feeling than a conventionally articulate threat would be. The darkness of the vault and the narrow corridors and the sound of Gary from everywhere and nowhere make Vault 108 one of the most atmospherically successful areas in the entire franchise. Vault 112, in the capital wasteland, is the virtual reality experiment, and it is worth considering in detail because it represents a particular kind of cruelty that is less immediately legible than the physical suffering of other Vault experiments. The Vault's residents were placed in specially designed pods and connected to a shared virtual reality simulation called Tranquility Lane, designed by a scientist named Stanislaus Braun. The simulation was a reproduction of a 1950s American suburb: green lawns, white picket fences, cheerful homes, children playing in the street. Warm and nostalgic and clearly artificial, but comfortable in the way that familiar things are comfortable. The residents of Vault 112 were aware, at least initially, that they were in a simulation. They entered their pods knowing they were going to experience Tranquility Lane rather than believing it was the real world. But awareness is not the same as agency. They could not leave. The pods maintained their physical bodies in a state of suspended animation while their minds experienced the simulation, and the only person with administrative control over the simulation was Braun. Braun, in the simulation, appeared as a child named Betty. From behind that face, he ran the world. He could introduce new elements, new rules, new crises. He could kill characters within the simulation and reset them, returning them to normal function with no memory of having died. He could erase relationships, implant false memories, arrange situations designed to maximize psychological suffering, and then remove the suffering and begin again. He had the power of a god in a small, detailed world, and over the century plus that the residents spent in Tranquility Lane, he used that power in ways that the terminal entries in the Vault document with a degree of specificity that is not pleasant to read. The most disturbing detail about Vault 112 is the duration, 200 years. Not a short story of cruelty, but a practice that continued, with variations and Braun's personal amusement driving the specific details, for 2 centuries. The bodies of the Vault residents aged in their pods, supported by life-sustaining equipment, while their minds experienced whatever Braun had arranged for them to experience. Some of them, according to terminal entries, had developed awareness of the pattern over the long years, an understanding that they were being played with rather than simply living in a simulation. That awareness did not give them any power to change their situation. It just made them conscious of it. When the player enters the simulation in Fallout 3, one of the first characters they can speak to is Old Lady Dithers, the one resident who will tell them plainly that this is not real, that something is wrong, that there is an abandoned house in the neighborhood, that no one is allowed to enter. She has figured out more than anyone else, and she cannot do anything with what she knows. She has been in there for over 200 years, and she knows it is a simulation, and she has been unable to affect her situation at all, and she will tell you where the abandoned house is and what you might find there with something approaching hope, because you, the player, are the first thing that has arrived in Tranquility Lane in a very long time that is not Braun. There is a failsafe in the simulation. If the player finds specific items scattered around the neighborhood and places them in the correct configuration, the simulation runs an old Chinese invasion subroutine, sending waves of simulated soldiers through Tranquility Lane who kill every resident. The residents die in the simulation, and death in the simulation kills the body in the pod, and that is the only exit available from Vault 112. Many players choose to activate the failsafe, and then they sit with what it means that merciful ends in the Fallout universe sometimes look like this. Vault 81, in the Commonwealth near Chestnut Hillock Reservoir, is unusual in the Vault network for having a living, functioning community when the player arrives in Fallout 4. Most vaults that appear in the games are abandoned or full of the dead. Vault 81's residents are alive, organized, maintaining their community, and engaged in the ongoing project of managing the relationship between their underground home and the increasingly hostile wasteland outside. They are doing about as well as any isolated post-war community could be expected to do. This makes them the exception, and the story buried in Vault 81's medical wing explains what they were protected from. Vault 81 was designed as a medical research facility. The original plan was comprehensive and systematic. A full battery of disease experiments, each pathogen modified and tested on the Vault's population in a sequence designed to generate data on treatments and cures for every significant human disease. The mole rats that lived in the Vault's lower levels were to serve as initial vectors, modified with disease strains and then used to produce treatments that would be tested on the human residents. Medical research at speed, using a captive population that had not consented to any of it. The Vault's chief scientist, a man named Curie's predecessor, began implementing the protocol. And then, for reasons that are documented in the Vault's records, he stopped. He was not removed. He was not overridden. He simply decided, apparently unilaterally, that what he was being asked to do was wrong, and he spent the rest of his tenure at the Vault systematically undermining the experiment. He destroyed most of his work. He kept one mole rat, modified with one disease and its potential cure, and eliminated every other experimental track. The automated systems continued to attempt implementation of the original protocol, but without a compliant scientist guiding them, and with their records corrupted by deliberate sabotage, they never managed to execute it. By the time the player arrives at Vault 81, the one modified mole rat still lives in the medical levels, carrying both the disease and its cure simultaneously. A child in the Vault has been infected with the disease through contact with the mole rat. The cure for the child is inside the creature. The only way to get it is to kill the animal and extract it. A single animal carrying the only available copy of a medicine, because one scientist, decades ago, made the decision to protect the people he was supposed to be experimenting on. The Vault survived because of that decision. The specific child's life is saved because of it too, if the player makes the right choices. Vault 75, located beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, is considerably less hopeful. Its experiment was a eugenics program targeting children. Parents were recruited by offering their children access to educational programs and physical safety inside the Vault. The children were admitted. The parents were told they would join them after completing a brief security intake process. The parents were killed after 48 hours. The children who survived the intake process were evaluated. Those who showed exceptional physical capability or intellectual performance were advanced to higher levels of the program. Those who did not meet the benchmarks were killed, and their useful biological materials were harvested. The children who demonstrated sufficient potential were put through a training and augmentation program designed to push human physical and cognitive performance to its limits, subjecting them to chemical treatments and conditioning regimes and increasingly demanding evaluations, all designed to produce a cohort of peak performance humans who could serve as a workforce and soldier class for whatever post-war civilization the Enclave and Vault-Tec intended to build. The Vault is empty when the player arrives, full of the records of what happened there. The clinical language of the evaluators reports. Applying the vocabulary of standardized testing and performance metrics to decisions about which 11-year-olds would live is a specific kind of horror that does not require dramatic presentation to land. The forms themselves do it. The language of bureaucracy applied to atrocity is one of the most disturbing combinations available in human experience, and Vault 75 understood that completely. Part 4. October 23rd, 2077. The 2 hours that ended everything. At 9:13 in the morning on October 23rd, 2077, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System registered the first confirmed missile launches. The system flagged the data and escalated it to the appropriate military and government contacts, and within 13 minutes the President of the United States had authorized a retaliatory strike in accordance with pre-established nuclear response protocols. At 9:26 in the morning, the United States fired back. At that moment, with missiles crossing the ocean in both directions simultaneously, the world that had existed for 2077 years was effectively over. What followed in the next 2 hours would determine the shape of the next 2 centuries. The question of who fired first is one Fallout has always handled carefully and deliberately ambiguously. The official enclave position, delivered by President Dick Richardson in Fallout 2, is that China launched a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States, and that the American response was proportionate and justified. Terminal entries in Fallout 4's Switchboard, a pre-war Defense Intelligence Agency facility, document the progression through DEFCON levels and the order to execute Scenario MX, CN91, with language that implies missiles were already incoming when the decision to retaliate was made. The in-game sources present a picture consistent with China having struck first and America having responded. But the Fallout Bible, the compendium of developer notes and lore documentation released by the franchise's original creators at Interplay, is more candid. The text states plainly that who fired first is unknown, and that it is not even certain whether the initial missiles came from China or America at all. Tim Kaine, one of Fallout's original creators, has said in interviews that the China angle was the canonical explanation at the time of the original game's development, but that he personally is not sure, and that the ambiguity is real rather than a gap in the lore. The most interesting reading of this ambiguity is not that it is an accidental oversight, but that it is a deliberate structural feature of the narrative. Fallout is a franchise deeply concerned with the question of institutional responsibility, with the tendency of powerful organizations to make decisions that destroy people without those decisions ever being clearly attributed to a single moment of choice. The Great War as an event without a clear first cause is consistent with that thematic concern. The bombs fell. No one person pulled the only trigger. The chain of decisions and automated responses and mutual escalations was so long and involved so many actors and automated systems that the question of who bears responsibility becomes genuinely unanswerable, which is exactly the kind of moral complexity the franchise finds interesting. What is certain is the immediate timeline of those hours. The missiles that House had predicted arrived when he had calculated they would, within a day. His defense grid over Las Vegas performed almost as intended. The Air Force scrambled what interceptors were still operational. Civil defense systems activated across the country, and air raid sirens sounded in cities and towns and suburbs from the Pacific coast to the eastern seaboard. In many places, the people who heard the sirens did not respond. Not from callousness, not from despair, but from familiarity. Emergency preparedness drills had been a regular feature of American civilian life for decades. The threat of nuclear war had been a background condition of existence for long enough that the specific psychology of it had shifted. The actual danger was real, but the constant state of alert had produced a kind of numbness, a tendency to file new warnings in the same mental category as all the previous warnings that had turned out to be drills. Many people heard the sirens on October 23, 2077, and assumed it was another drill. They stayed in their homes, they looked up from what they were doing, and then the sky lit up and the windows broke, and it was not a drill. The people who made it into vaults were the minority who had been selected through Vault-Tec's lottery system and who happened to be close enough to a vault entrance when the sirens went off and who decided, correctly, that this time was different. The vault doors were on automated timers. They would close at a predetermined moment regardless of how many people were inside, regardless of whether the full intended population had arrived, regardless of whether parents had been separated from children or partners from each other in the chaos of the evacuation. The doors closed, and the people on the wrong side of them died in the fire or in the longer, slower deaths that followed. Some people survived outside the vaults. Subway systems provided shelter for those who reached them in time. Structurally sound basements in buildings that were not direct targets gave some people enough shielding to survive the initial blasts. The Pulowski preservation shelters, the upright personal pods that appear on pre-war streets throughout the games, saved a handful of individuals who happened to be using one when the bombs fell, though the people who climbed into a Pulowski shelter and then survived the war would have emerged to find themselves alone in a devastated landscape with nowhere obvious to go. In rural areas far enough from primary targets, some communities survived relatively intact in the immediate term, only to face the slower catastrophe of fallout, contaminated water, and the collapse of the supply networks they had always depended on. The radiation spread. In the days and weeks after the war, the fallout patterns determined who survived and who did not among the surface population. Black rain fell over large areas, precipitation carrying radioactive particles from the debris clouds of nuclear detonations, and it poisoned water sources and soil alike. The nuclear winter that followed, as particulate matter in the upper atmosphere reduced incoming solar energy, damaged whatever food production capacity had survived the initial strikes. The immediate death toll from the bombs themselves was enormous. The death toll in the following months from radiation sickness, starvation, and the collapse of medical infrastructure was arguably larger. The radiation that did not kill people sometimes changed them, not in the comic book manner of sudden dramatic mutation, but in a slow, cellular process that played out over years and decades. People who received very high doses of radiation but survived, particularly those who spent extended periods in heavily contaminated areas, began to undergo a transformation that had no precedent in pre-war medicine. Their cells continued to die, as cells always do, but the replacement process became increasingly abnormal. Pigmentation faded, and skin began to break down and slough away. The immune system adapted to function under conditions that should have been fatal. Organs that should have failed continued to operate. The body, bombarded by radiation, became something that was no longer quite human in its biology, but retained human consciousness, human memory, human personality. These were the first ghouls. And what to do about ghouls? Whether they were people or something other than people, whether their radiation tolerance made them a threat or a resource or simply a different category of person with the same rights as anyone else, became one of the central ethical and political questions of the post-war wasteland, and it remained contested and unresolved across all 200 years that the games cover. The Enclave had a clear position on this question. Radiation exposure of any kind made an organism, in their taxonomy, a mutant, and mutants were not acceptable as citizens of the restored America they intended to build. Ghouls, super mutants, and even the ordinary human wastelanders who had been breathing irradiated air and drinking contaminated water for generations were all, by Enclave reckoning, insufficiently pure to be part of the future. The Enclave's plan, most clearly articulated in Fallout 2 but present as a background assumption in everything they do, was to deal with the contaminated population through a mechanism rather than through negotiation or assistance. The mechanism was the forced evolutionary virus, modified as a weapon, but we will get to that. Part 5. The forced evolutionary virus, the science that tried to remake humanity and mostly just broke it. The history of the forced evolutionary virus begins not with warfare or political conspiracy, but with a genuinely ambitious scientific project aimed at something that sounds, on its face, like an enormous good. In the 1970s of the Fallout timeline, a private research organization called Vault-Tec was engaged in a project formally designated the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, funded by a combination of private capital and government grants. The goal of the project was to develop a virus capable of conferring broad-spectrum disease immunity on its host, a biological agent that, once introduced into a human body, would restructure the immune system's response capability in ways that protected against a wide range of pathogens. The medical applications were obvious. A treatment that could make populations resistant to bacterial and viral infections would transform public health globally. The military applications were almost as obvious. Soldiers who could not be taken out of action by disease would be more effective in sustained field operations. Vault-Tec was doing legitimate science toward a legitimate goal. What the researchers discovered in the course of their work was that certain variants of the virion they were developing did something much more dramatic than adjusting immune function. They interacted with human DNA at a fundamental level, restructuring the genetic code of their host rather than merely modifying the immune response. The modifications were not predictable or easily controlled. They were substantial. Muscle density increased dramatically. Brain activity patterns changed. Cellular reproduction accelerated. Size increased. The organisms that emerged from prolonged exposure to these variants were not enhanced humans in the controlled, specific way the project had aimed for. They were transformed in ways that bore a complex, unpredictable relationship to the original organism. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project became the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project when the United States military took formal control of the research and redirected its focus. The therapeutic possibilities became secondary. The military possibility, soldiers whose physical capabilities were dramatically amplified, was primary. The project moved to the Mariposa military base in the California desert, a facility specifically designed for the work, and the experiments moved from laboratory animals to human subjects. Military prisoners were used as test subjects, dipped into vats of FEV solution, and observed. The results were consistent in their broad outlines and deeply disturbing in their specifics. Test subjects who survived the FEV immersion process became dramatically larger and stronger. Their intelligence generally declined, though this was not universal. They became sterile. They became, in the official terminology of the project, super mutants, stronger, larger, more physically resilient than any unmodified human, but not what the military had hoped for, not controlled, not directed, not capable of operating as soldiers in any conventional sense. The transformation was not enhancement. It was replacement. The garrison at Mariposa, the soldiers tasked with guarding the Vault-Tec scientists and the Mariposa facility, became increasingly disturbed by what they were witnessing. The experiments on prisoners were visible to them, at least in their broad outlines, and the results were legible enough that you did not need to be a scientist to understand that what was happening in those vats was not producing better soldiers. The commander of the garrison responded to the weight of what he was seeing by taking his own life. His successor, Captain Roger Maxson, took a more activist approach. Maxson interrogated the Vault-Tec scientists. He obtained confessions about the nature of the experiments and the lack of informed consent from any of the subjects. On October 20th, 2077, with the Great War still 3 days away, he transmitted an open declaration of secession from the United States government, citing the FEV experiments as one of his justifications. He received no response, because the chain of command he was addressing had already begun the process of evacuating itself to offshore facilities in anticipation of the war. When the bombs fell 3 days later, Maxson and his unit were at Mariposa, cut off from any authority, in possession of advanced military technology and a facility full of experimental horror, staring at a world that had fundamentally changed. They marched west toward the Lost Hills bunker in Southern California, gathering the dependents of their unit's families as they went, and sealed themselves inside. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Steel. They built their early ideology around the conviction that pre-war technology, specifically the weapons technology and biological research that had produced the war and the experiments, needed to be controlled by responsible stewards rather than left in the hands of organizations that had demonstrated their willingness to use it for atrocities. Roger Maxson wrote the early versions of the codex that would guide Brotherhood doctrine for generations. The FEV, meanwhile, did not stay at Mariposa. The vats were sealed when Maxson's unit left, but the facility sat empty and irradiated for decades, and eventually attracted explorers. Among them was a man named Richard Gray, who arrived as part of a hub merchant expedition several decades after the Great War. The Mariposa security systems, still partially functional, killed most of the expedition. Gray was knocked into one of the FEV vats in the chaos. He survived. His prolonged immersion in the solution produced changes that went far beyond what any of the Mariposa test subjects had experienced. Gray's intelligence did not decline. It expanded dramatically. His body transformed, but his mind remained, growing in ways that his own subsequent writings describe as simultaneously illuminating and agonizing. He began calling himself the Master, which was partly genuine conviction and partly a recognition that whatever he had become was so different from what he had been that a new name was appropriate. He gained the ability to link his consciousness to computer systems, to interface directly with technology in ways that no unmodified human could. He began to think. The conclusion the Master arrived at was not immediately obvious as monstrous, which is what makes him one of Fallout's most genuinely interesting antagonists rather than simply a villain. He looked at what the FEV had made of him and arrived at a philosophical position. Humanity, in its existing form, was clearly not capable of surviving long-term. The Great War was proof of that. The wasteland was proof of that. Human beings left to their natural state would simply continue making the same mistakes, competing for resources, dividing themselves into hostile groups, failing to coordinate around shared interests, until they managed to finish what the Great War started. The species was, in a meaningful sense, broken by its own nature. But super mutants were, in the Master's analysis, potentially not broken in the same way. They were physically more capable. They were immune to radiation. They did not reproduce, which initially seemed like a liability, but which the Master reframed as an advantage. By transforming the human population into super mutants through controlled exposure to FEV, he could create a single, unified race that was not competing for reproductive advantage, not divided by the genetic variation that produced conflict, not subject to the biological drives that had made human beings so good at destroying each other. He called the project the Unity. He spent years building an army to carry it out. The deep irony that the Master did not fully reckon with, the fact that brought his entire plan down, was that super mutants are sterile. Every single one of them, without exception. The Unity, if it succeeded, would produce one final generation of transformed beings, and then stop. There would be no next generation. The plan to save humanity by transforming it would end humanity just as surely as doing nothing, just more slowly, and with more control over the timing. The Vault Dweller, protagonist of the original Fallout, is the one who delivers this information to the Master in a way he cannot dismiss, presenting the biological evidence clearly enough that the Master's own calculations have to acknowledge it. What happens next is one of the franchise's finest moments. The Master does not become violent. He does not try to destroy the evidence or kill the messenger. He acknowledges it, he processes it. His life's work, the thing that had organized every action of the past decade, rested on an assumption that turned out to be false. He destroyed himself and his base. The Unity died with him. And the question of whether the plan could ever have worked, whether there was some version of FEV application that could have produced viable offspring, is one that subsequent lore explores through various other organizations' research without ever providing a comfortable answer. The Enclave's version of FEV, developed in Fallout 2, was not aimed at transformation but at extinction. Enclave scientists, working with samples recovered from the ruins of Mariposa, produced a strain designated FEV Curling 13, specifically engineered to be lethal to any organism with radiation-induced mutations. In the wasteland, that meant essentially everyone who had lived on the surface for any period of time: ghouls, super mutants, and ordinary humans whose bodies carried the accumulated genetic effects of 2 centuries of radiation exposure. The Enclave intended to introduce this strain into the water supply, killing the existing wasteland population and leaving the surface clear for resettlement by the Enclave's own radiation-free population. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 2 prevented this. The Enclave's oil rig facility was destroyed. The weaponized FEV was not deployed on the scale they intended, but the knowledge of it survived, because knowledge is harder to destroy than facilities. Part 6. The factions of the wasteland: 2 centuries of trying to build something that lasts. The wasteland that the various Fallout games explore is not the empty devastation that greeted the first survivors in the months after the war. 200 years, or close to it, had passed. 200 years is an enormous amount of time, long enough for organizations to form, fight, fracture, and reconstitute, for ideologies to develop and harden and splinter, for economies to emerge around trade routes, and for trade routes to develop around water sources and defensible positions, and the sites of pre-war infrastructure that could be salvaged. The wasteland by the time of Fallout 3 and New Vegas and 4 is in many ways more politically complex than the pre-war world it replaced, because the political complexity emerged from genuine competition for survival rather than from the slow accumulation of institutional inertia. The Brotherhood of Steel carries the weight of its founding moment through every iteration of the faction. That founding moment was, as we have discussed, Roger Maxon's rebellion at Mariposa, the discovery of FEV experiments, the executions, the secession, the march to Lost Hills. What it baked into the Brotherhood's DNA was a particular combination of values that proves difficult to consistently apply in a complicated world. The Brotherhood believes in the value of technology and the danger of technology. It believes that advanced weapons and scientific research are inherently dangerous in the hands of the uninformed, and that the Brotherhood's role is to collect and control that technology, building a responsible stewardship that prevents another catastrophe like the Great War. This is not an unreasonable position given what the Great War actually was. It is, from certain angles, the correct lesson to draw from the evidence. But the practical implementation of that position in the post-war world creates consistent problems. The technology the Brotherhood hoards is often technology the wasteland's population desperately needs to protect itself and to rebuild. The Brotherhood's definition of who is responsible enough to handle technology tends to align suspiciously closely with who is already a Brotherhood member. And the organization's military capability, which is considerable, creates a power dynamic between the Brotherhood and surface communities that is inherently hierarchical, regardless of how any particular Brotherhood leader intends to use it. Different chapters of the Brotherhood in different regions have arrived at different accommodations with this tension. The Capital Wasteland chapter under Elder Owen Lyons took a position that was genuinely unusual for the Brotherhood: active engagement with the civilian population, fighting super mutants on behalf of people who could not fight them alone, and a degree of openness to relationships with surface communities that most Brotherhood doctrine explicitly discourages. This made Lyons widely beloved among the people of the Capital Wasteland, and widely criticized within the Brotherhood hierarchy, which viewed his departure from the hoarding and control model as a dangerous deviation. His daughter, Sarah, continued his approach. The faction that emerges in Fallout 3's Broken Steel DLC, with the Brotherhood's Lyons chapter having defeated the Enclave and remaining as the dominant military force in the region, is the closest the franchise ever gets to showing a Brotherhood that is actually fulfilling the protective role they claim to value. Whether that outcome was sustainable, whether the Brotherhood of the Capital Wasteland could have maintained it without the pressure of the super mutant threat to organize against, is a question the games do not explore, because Fallout 4 takes place 200 miles north and several years later. The Brotherhood of Fallout 4, under Arthur Maxson, who is a descendant of the founder and who rose to leadership of his East Coast chapter at a remarkably young age after a series of events detailed in the in-game lore, represents a different resolution of the same tensions. Maxson's Brotherhood is confident, organized, militarily powerful, and ideologically certain in ways that Lyons' chapter never was. They know what the Brotherhood is for. They know what needs to be collected and what needs to be destroyed. They have the resources to act on both convictions, and they do, with an efficiency that is impressive and a certainty that is, depending on your position relative to their missions, either reassuring or terrifying. The Brotherhood in Fallout 4 has decided that synths are an existential threat requiring destruction rather than a moral question requiring discussion. This position is consistent with their broader doctrine about technology. The Institute's Gen 3 synths are extraordinarily advanced technology that is being used without proper oversight and is causing harm, and the Brotherhood's response to that situation is the same as their response to any other technology problem, which is to destroy the immediate threat and seize what can be salvaged. The fact that Gen 3 synths are biologically human, that they experience what functions as consciousness and emotion and memory, is not, in the Brotherhood's framework, relevant. They are technology. Technology is controlled or destroyed. Paladin Danse, the player's potential companion in Fallout 4, is the most direct expression of the problem with this framework. He is one of the Brotherhood's most committed and effective members, a true believer whose devotion to the cause is genuine rather than performative. He is also, as the player eventually discovers through Institute records, a Gen 3 synth who has no knowledge of his own artificial nature. Every memory he has of his life before the Brotherhood, the experiences that shaped his personality and his values, the relationships that defined him, appears to be authentic to him in every subjective sense. He is, by his own experience, a person. He is, by the Brotherhood's taxonomy, a machine to be destroyed. The new California Republic represents the most successful attempt in the post-war West to rebuild something resembling pre-war civilizational structure. Beginning in the hub trading community in Southern California and growing through political consolidation of surrounding settlements over several generations, the NCR had, by the time of Fallout New Vegas, developed functional democratic institutions, a Senate, elected leadership, a judicial system, a standing army, a currency, and a network of trade agreements that extended across the region. By any standard measure of what post-apocalyptic civilization recovery looks like, the NCR is an extraordinary achievement. It is also, by the time the games depict it, beginning to show the specific structural problems of rapid expansion without adequate institutional development. The NCR's territory has grown faster than its ability to provide services to that territory. Corruption has become endemic at multiple levels of government. The military is overextended, maintaining frontier commitments it cannot fully support. The civilian population is experiencing the particular disillusionment that comes from discovering that the democratic institutions they were told would protect them are inhabited by people with the same range of human failings as everyone else. Fallout New Vegas is careful not to make this a simple condemnation. The NCR's flaws are real and documented. So is its achievement. The choice the game asks the player to make between supporting the NCR, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House's independent operation, or their own independent authority is genuinely difficult in a way that reflects the genuine difficulty of evaluating political systems in the real world, where the question is not which option is theoretically ideal, but which option causes the least harm given the specific conditions and the available alternatives. Caesar's Legion, the fourth major faction of New Vegas, was the creation of Edward Sallow, a scholar trained by the followers of the apocalypse, who was sent with a research expedition to the Grand Canyon region and was captured there by a tribal group called the Blackfoots. Facing the Blackfoots' intention to ransom him, Sallow used the knowledge he had, classical history, specifically Roman military organization and social structure, which he had studied extensively as an academic discipline. He offered to teach the Blackfoots how to fight and organize like Romans. The Blackfoots defeated their enemies. Sallow crowned himself Caesar. The expansion that followed, over roughly 20 years, absorbed 87 tribes into the Legion, each conquest accompanied by the destruction of the conquered tribe's cultural identity and its replacement with a Roman-derived Legion identity. The Legion's language borrowed from Latin. Its ranks reproduced Roman military structure. Its social organization was explicitly modeled on late Republican Rome. Martial, hierarchical, patriarchal, absolutely intolerant of any form of dissent or cultural autonomy within its borders. The result, by the time New Vegas takes place, is an organization that provides the specific kind of stability that comes from absolute enforcement. The roads within Legion territory are safe, the water supplies are protected, the structures of daily life are reliable in a way they are not in NCR territory, where corruption and understaffing produce constant gaps in service delivery. Edward Sallow built something that works, in its specific terms, and works because everyone inside it is utterly aware of the cost of not working. Joshua Graham, the man who served as Caesar's legate for the First Battle of Hoover Dam before the Legion's defeat, provides the other angle on what the Legion is. Graham, born Mormon and now a deeply sincere Christian in the post-war wasteland, spent years as Caesar's most effective military officer and most committed believer in the Legion's project. When he failed at Hoover Dam, Caesar had him covered in pitch, set alight, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. Graham survived, through a combination of extraordinary physical resilience and what his own account describes as divine intervention. He found his way north to Zion Canyon, where the Honest Hearts DLC finds him, and he has spent the years since attempting to reconcile his faith with his history and his ongoing capacity for violence. Graham is one of the most carefully written characters in the franchise, partly because his position at the intersection of the Legion's ideology and genuine Christian ethics produces a specific kind of moral complexity that the game takes seriously. He is not redeemed in the conventional narrative sense. He is trying to figure out what redemption means given what he did and what he still is. Part 7. Mr. House and His Kingdom: The Long Game of an Extraordinary Mind. Robert Edwin House is described in Fallout New Vegas's lore as the greatest entrepreneur of the 21st century in the Fallout universe, which is a claim that the available evidence mostly supports. He founded Robco Industries at 22. He built it into a company whose products were ubiquitous throughout American daily life. Pip-Boy computing devices, Protectron robots, Securitron combat units, the Lucky 38 casino itself, and dozens of other commercial and industrial products. By the time of the Great War, Robco was one of the most significant technology companies in the country, and House was one of its wealthiest citizens. But his real contribution to the Fallout universe is not his commercial success. It is his planning. House had been running predictive models on global geopolitical stability since the 1980s, using algorithms he had developed personally based on methodologies that were, at the time, genuinely ahead of anything else available. The models incorporated economic data, military spending patterns, resource availability projections, political stability indices, and a range of other variables, and they produced a conclusion that House reached sometime in the middle of the decade. Nuclear war was not merely possible but effectively certain within the next century. The probability was high enough that the reasonable response was not to try to prevent the war, but to prepare for it. His preparations were extraordinary in their scope. He spent, by his own later accounting, 40% of Robco's total wealth on preparations for the post-war world. He commissioned the subterranean server complex beneath the Lucky 38, a facility built to house his preserved consciousness and the systems necessary to maintain Las Vegas's infrastructure indefinitely. He worked with the federal government, leveraging his military contracts and political connections to get defensive missile installations placed around the Las Vegas metropolitan area. He deployed his Securitron army throughout the city. He developed the life support systems that would allow him to hibernate for as long as necessary. He also made the investments that would pay off after the war: strategic stockpiles of resources and technology, operational infrastructure that could be maintained by automated systems, contractual relationships with the casino families who would eventually run the strip under his authority. Robert House prepared for the apocalypse the way a very good engineer prepares for a system failure, by building redundancy into every critical element and then building more redundancy on top of that. His prediction that the war would begin on October 22nd was off by one day. His defense grid came online fractionally late. 9 missiles got through. Las Vegas survived, though not unscathed. When the player encounters House in Fallout New Vegas, he has been running the city for over 200 years. His physical body is preserved in a life support capsule behind layers of automated security in the Lucky 38. His consciousness operates through the casino's server systems and interfaces with the outside world through Securitron monitors and cameras and the network of automated systems he controls throughout the strip. He is, in the most technical sense, alive. But the nature of his existence has changed in ways that would be difficult for any human mind to process without consequence. 200 years in isolation. 200 years of interacting with the world through intermediaries and cameras. 200 years of watching the wasteland develop without being able to directly participate in it, without being able to walk through it, touch it, smell it, experience it as anything other than data and video feeds and the reports of the agents he employs. House is still brilliant. His analysis of the Mojave's political situation is the most accurate available. His long-term planning remains extraordinary. But his relationship to other people has become, over those 2 centuries, increasingly abstract. He does not dislike people. That is not quite the right framing. He has simply reached a point where other people are primarily variables in his calculations, resources and obstacles and instruments to be appropriately employed. The courier, the player character, is a particularly useful instrument, capable, adaptable, and possessed of the specific combination of skills the Mojave's current situation requires. House treats the courier with the closest thing to respect he can generate, which is a kind of focused, transactional attention that recognizes their usefulness and compensates it accordingly. What House wants, in the long run, is stated clearly enough in the game's conversation system if you push him on it. He intends to consolidate control of the Mojave, use the resources of the region to rebuild a functioning industrial base, and eventually launch humanity into space. Not the humanity of the NCR, which he regards as a repetition of the democratic experiments that produced the Great War. Not the humanity of Caesar's Legion, which he regards as romantically backward-looking. Not the humanity that currently inhabits the wasteland, which he regards mostly as raw material. The humanity that House envisions for the stars is an optimized, technologically advanced, House-directed project, and the specific human beings currently alive in the Mojave are mostly relevant to that project as workers and cannon fodder. This is not a position that most players find sympathetic once it is articulated clearly. House is smart enough to know that, and he is careful about how he presents it. He emphasizes the forward-looking aspects, the space travel, the long-term survival of the species, the escape from the cycle of resource wars that destroyed the old world. He is less forthcoming about the specifics of who gets to participate in that future and under what conditions, and whether they have any say in it. The Platinum Chip, the item that drives the game's central conflict from the moment Benny shoots the courier to steal it, is a data storage device containing an updated operating system for House's Securitron army. The Securitrons are capable but limited in their current configuration. The chip's software would upgrade them to full military capacity, enough to make House's force genuinely dominant in the Mojave, rather than merely significant. The vault beneath Fortification Hill, the hill that serves as Caesar's Legion's stronghold near Hoover Dam, contains hundreds of Securitrons in storage, waiting for the chip to bring them online. Whoever controls the chip controls the outcome of the game's central conflict. That is why Benny was willing to shoot a courier in the head to get it. Mr. New Vegas, the warm and personable radio DJ whose voice fills the airwaves of New Vegas radio throughout the game, is one of the details about House's pre-war planning that tends to generate a specific kind of feeling in players who learn what he actually is. He is an artificial intelligence created before the Great War specifically to provide civilian broadcasting services. He is not a human being and has never been one. He was designed to sound exactly like one, and he succeeds completely. His warmth, his apparent interest in the listener's well-being, his good humor, and his genuine-sounding emotional engagement with the news he delivers, all of it is the output of an algorithm that has been running in a building in Las Vegas for over 200 years. He is voiced by Wayne Newton, whose career was so closely associated with Las Vegas that he was nicknamed Mr. Las Vegas for decades. The casting is one of those moments in New Vegas's design that lands at the intersection of funny and melancholy, a decision that rewards the player for recognizing it and then immediately makes the thing recognized a little sadder. Part 8. The Institute and the Horror of the Indistinguishable Synths, Identity, and What Consciousness Means. The Institute of Fallout 4 is a masterpiece of institutional horror, specifically because it does not look like horror from the inside. The Institute is clean and well-lit and air-conditioned. Its scientists wear proper laboratory coats. Its common areas have cafeteria tables and conversation and the ambient sounds of an academic community at work. After any amount of time spent in the Commonwealth, with its ruined buildings and irradiated rain and hostile creatures and desperate, exhausted people, walking into the Institute for the first time has the quality of a dream. A cold, controlled, uncomfortably perfect dream. The Institute is the successor to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which survived the Great War largely intact due to its underground research infrastructure, and has spent the following 2 centuries pursuing research agendas that became increasingly disconnected from the surface world as the generations turned over and the people who remembered the surface died, and were replaced by people who had only read about it. The Institute's current generation, by the time Fallout 4 takes place, is mostly born and raised underground. The surface is a theoretical concept for most of them. Its residents are subjects of academic interest rather than fellow human beings. The Institute's flagship technology is the Synth program. Generation 3 synths are biologically complete human beings, constructed rather than born, with genuine organic tissue, genuine blood, functioning organs, and a brain that produces whatever neurological processes correspond to thought, memory, emotion, and experience in humans. Gen 3 synths age. They form memories. They develop personalities shaped by experience. They feel what functions as fear and affection and grief and hope. They are, by every biological and behavioral measure available, people. The Institute regards them as property. Their position on this is not frivolous or obviously hypocritical given their starting premises. Gen 3 synths were created by the Institute for the Institute's purposes, and the question of whether the consciousness they experience constitutes personhood in a morally significant sense is one that the Institute's ethical framework has resolved in the negative. Synths are sophisticated technology. Technology is controlled and used and replaced when necessary. The Institute's replacement program, which involves abducting surface residents, creating Gen 3 synth duplicates to replace them, and using those duplicates for intelligence gathering and influence operations, is not, in the Institute's internal assessment, ethically problematic. It is an operational tool. The Railroad exists in direct opposition to this assessment. Organized as a network of safe houses and secret agents, the Railroad believes that Gen 3 synths are conscious, that their consciousness constitutes personhood, and that the Institute's treatment of them is slavery. The Railroad extracts synths who have escaped the Institute, provides them with new identities through a memory modification process, and relocates them to places where the Institute's courser retrieval units cannot find them. It is a dangerous operation, not least because the Institute has both the motivation and the capability to infiltrate the Railroad with synth operatives, creating the very paranoia about identity and authenticity that the Railroad's mission is designed to combat. Paladin Dance is the character who most directly confronts the player with the philosophical stakes of the synth question. He is introduced as a Brotherhood of Steel officer, dedicated and effective, whose views on synths are exactly what you would expect from a Brotherhood member under Elder Maxon's leadership. Synths are abominations, they are a threat to the human population, and they need to be destroyed or, at minimum, permanently decommissioned. He has strong opinions on this. He expresses them regularly. When Institute records reveal that Dance himself is a Gen 3 synth, and that he has no knowledge of this fact, the moment is built as a reveal specifically designed to be devastating. The player is told this information before Dance is. The choice of how to handle the revelation, including whether to follow Maxon's order to execute him, is entirely in the player's hands. Dance's response, when he learns the truth, is not anger. It is collapse. His entire identity, everything he understands himself to be, was organized around being a Brotherhood soldier and a committed defender of humanity against the synth threat. He cannot hold that identity alongside the fact of his own artificial origin. He asks the player to kill him. He does not frame this as a request born of despair, but as a logical conclusion. He is what he has spent his career fighting against, and the Brotherhood does not accommodate contradictions of that kind. The player who has spent any time getting to know Dance, walking through the Commonwealth with him, listening to his opinions and his history and his values, is confronted at that moment with a question the game has been building toward. If everything that constitutes a person, their memories, their relationships, their values, their fears, their hope, their experience of the world, is authentic to them in every subjective sense, in what sense are they not a person? The fact that those things were constructed rather than developed organically does not change their reality as experienced. Dance is not performing being Dance. He is Dance. He just also happens to be a machine. The question is not answered for you. The game presents it and then waits. Sturges, the cheerful, talented mechanic who lives in Sanctuary Hills with the Minutemen, provides a more subtle version of the same question. He is never confirmed to be a synth within the main game, but there are behavioral and physical characteristics present in his design that suggest artificial origin, and the community has discussed this at length. If he is a synth, he does not know it. He goes about his life, helps the community, expresses genuine care for the people around him, and exists in the same moral territory as Dance. A person who might or might not be a person, depending on which definition you are using. The Institute's Courser program, which is how they retrieve escaped synths, adds a specific texture to the paranoia the synth question generates. Coursers are Gen 3 synths modified for combat and retrieval operations, sent to the surface to find and bring back escaped synths. They are extraordinarily capable and extremely difficult to fight. The existence of coursers means that any sufficiently capable stranger the player encounters in the Commonwealth might be an Institute retrieval agent. The paranoia this generates is part of the point. Father, the director of the Institute revealed to be the sole survivor's son, Sean grown old, is the character who most fully articulates the Institute's self-understanding, and he is carefully written to be neither simply villainous nor simply sympathetic. His conviction that the Institute represents humanity's best chance at survival is genuine. His analytical intelligence is real. His understanding of the Commonwealth's political situation is accurate. His assessment that the surface population is probably not going to successfully rebuild civilization without the Institute's intervention is, depending on which of the game's 4 factions you have spent time with, not obviously wrong. What Father cannot fully account for is the cost of his methods, specifically the replacement program and the experimentation that preceded the current state of the synth program. He acknowledges these things. He does not apologize for them. They were necessary steps, in his understanding, toward the long-term goal, and the long-term goal justifies the means because the alternative is the continued failure of surface society. The player who arrives in the Institute has to decide what to do with all of this, and the game provides no comfortable resolution. Every available ending involves significant costs. The factions that can destroy the Institute do not have fully convincing answers to the questions the Institute raises about what comes next. The Institute ending requires the player to become complicit in the continuation of programs they have probably come to find troubling. There is no clean option. This is the Fallout universe at its most characteristic. A situation where every available choice is complicated, where the easiest moral positions are the ones with the most hidden costs, and where the most honest engagement with the options requires sitting with genuine uncertainty about what the right thing is. Part 9. The Dunwich Thread Lovecraft in the Wasteland and the Limits of the Rational. There is something running through the Fallout universe that does not fit cleanly into the frameworks the franchise's surface lore provides. It is not radiation, not political conflict, not the consequences of pre-war technology. It is older than any of that. It appears in specific locations, in carefully placed terminal entries and environmental details, and it suggests that the world of Fallout contains things that the Resource Wars and the Great War and the FEV experiments barely scratched. The Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 is the most prominent node of this thread, and it rewards attention out of proportion to the amount of the game that explicitly directs players toward it. The building is located in the southwestern corner of the Capital Wasteland map, far from most of the game's major content. There is no main quest that takes you there. No unique weapon requires you to visit it. There is, from a purely functional playthrough perspective, no particular reason to go. When you do go, the experience is immediately different from the rest of the game in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely. The ghouls that inhabit it are expected. The darkness of the interior is normal. What is not normal is what happens as you descend through the building's levels. You begin to experience perceptual disturbances. The game engine produces what appear to be visual echoes of the building as it was before the war, populated by figures engaged in activities that, on examination, appear to be ritual in nature. Something is happening in those images that is not explained by anything the game's established lore provides. The terminal entries in the building describe a pre-war organization operating out of the space. The language they use to describe their activities is not the language of technology or military research or any of the other pre-war institutional frameworks that normally produce the horror in Fallout settings. It is the language of devotion, of service, of something that demanded things from its adherents and received them. The entity referred to in those entries carries a name drawn from the H.P. Lovecraft tradition, Ugg-Qualtoth, and the building itself is named Dunwich, which is the title of one of Lovecraft's most famous stories, a story about a site in rural Massachusetts where something old and incomprehensible had maintained a presence for a very long time. The deliberateness of the Lovecraft reference is confirmed by context and by the subsequent use of the same thread in Fallout 4's Dunwich Borers. This is not a Lovecraft reference that slipped in through cultural osmosis or casual association. It is placed with intent, as a signal that the territory you are entering is related to something in the broader Fallout universe that the franchise's normal explanatory frameworks do not cover. Dunwich Borers is a quarry in the Commonwealth, and its relationship to the Capital Wasteland's Dunwich building is made clear by the shared name and the shared quality of what happens when you descend into it. The quarry was a working operation before the war, extracting material from the bedrock below a residential neighborhood. And as you descend through its levels, you again experience visions, flashes of the pre-war workers at the site engaged in behavior that is increasingly difficult to read as ordinary labor. Something in the deep rock was influencing them. The terminal entries from the quarry's management document a progressive deterioration in normal workplace behavior, attributed in the official records to stress and interpersonal conflict but legible, to the player who has read the Dunwich Building's entries, as something else. At the very bottom of the quarry, in water that glows with a particular quality of radiation, there is a stone idol. Its design is consistent with what you would expect given the Dunwich Building's materials. And a terminal entry there, from someone in the facility's final period of operation, mentions Ugg-Qualtoth. The game does not explain this. There is no quest that resolves the Dunwich thread. No character you can speak to who will give you a comprehensive account of what was going on in those locations and what it means for the broader Fallout universe. The developers built this content, placed it carefully, confirmed the Lovecraft reference through the naming and the thematic consistency, and then left it as a deliberate, unresolved element of the setting. One interpretation is that this is pure atmospheric horror, using Lovecraftian aesthetics to create a distinct tonal register without actually committing to the metaphysical implications. The Dunwich locations are scary and weird, and their weirdness comes from the right literary tradition, and that is all they need to be. Another interpretation, which the placement of the content and its deliberate connection across two games separated by years of development suggests, is that the Fallout universe genuinely contains things that are not explicable through its normal mechanics. That somewhere under the chronology of resource wars and FEV experiments and Vault experiments, there is a layer of something older that has its own history and its own interests, and that the events of the last few centuries have disturbed without fully engaging. The Children of Atom, Fallout's nuclear religion, have been present since Fallout 3's Megaton setting and have expanded significantly in subsequent entries, including a substantial storyline in Far Harbor and appearances in Fallout 76. The children worship radiation as a manifestation of the divine, calling the nuclear detonations that ended the old world the Great Division, the moment when Atom revealed itself by splitting the world into a before and an after. This theology is comprehensible as a post-apocalyptic belief system. People building meaning from the catastrophe that shaped their reality, creating a framework that makes the bomb's victims into something other than simply victims. But certain elements of the Children of Atom's practices, particularly in the Far Harbor and Fallout 76 storylines, suggest a knowledge of atomic physics and its effects on biological organisms that a post-war cult developing doctrine from first principles should not have. The High Confessor Tectus in Far Harbor demonstrates an understanding of the children's faith that operates at a level of sophistication that sits oddly with the rest of the faction's presentation. Whether this is a writer's inconsistency, a deliberate hint at some hidden source of knowledge, or an intentional ambiguity left for players to interpret, the franchise has not clarified. Part 10, Easter Eggs and Developer Secrets, The Hidden Layer of the Wasteland. Bethesda games have a long-standing tradition of rewarding close attention, and the Fallout entries are particularly generous in this regard. The developers who build these games consistently leave evidence of their own personalities and sense of humor and emotional investment in the work scattered throughout the environments they create, and finding those traces feels like a different kind of archaeology from the official lore archaeology. It is finding the people who made the thing inside the thing they made. The Titanic reference in Far Harbor is one of the franchise's most widely shared Easter eggs, partly because it is done so well. North of the nucleus settlement, in a lake, two skeletons lie together on a door, one laid across it, one submerged beside it with one arm still draped over the edge in a grip that has been maintained for 2 centuries. The reference to the 1997 James Cameron film is unmistakable. The door is demonstrably large enough to have supported both of them. The developers were clearly aware of the ongoing cultural argument about that scene, and they registered their opinion with skeleton props in a radioactive lake in a fictional Maine island settlement. It is a small, specific, very human thing to do. The Nirnroot from the Elder Scrolls series, the distinctive luminescent plant with its characteristic chiming ambient sound, appears in Senior Scribe Naraya's laboratory aboard the Brotherhood airship Pridwin in Fallout 4. It is labeled only as an experimental plant and produces no sound in this context, stripping it of the characteristic audio cue that makes it immediately recognizable in its home franchise. The visual design, though, is identical. This is Bethesda's team acknowledging the shared creative ecosystem between their franchises, and it rewards players who move between both worlds. Codsworth, the Mr. Handy robot who maintained the sole survivor's Sanctuary Hills home for 210 years while waiting for the family to come back, can say an extraordinary range of names when addressing the player character. The list was compiled from common name registries and then extended during development to include a variety of entries that were clearly the product of someone on the writing team having a great deal of fun with the margins of the official assignment. Among the names Codsworth can say, Doomguy, Dragonborn, Nora, Nate, Sean, Todd, Fuckface, and Fucksticks, the last 2 apparently making it through review because they fall within the, technically speaking, it is just a name logic that the list was built around. Someone on the Bethesda team clearly lobbied hard for those names, and whatever argument they made for including them was apparently persuasive enough. In Fallout New Vegas, the utility poles in the Freeside district carry small plaques labeled TES-04. The reference is to the Elder Scrolls 4, Oblivion. It is subtle enough to be easily missed in normal gameplay, placed at a height that does not naturally draw the eye, and small enough that you need to be specifically looking for it. Only players who know both franchises and who are specifically examining the environmental details of Freeside will notice it. It is there anyway. It was put there for the people who would find it, and the people who find it will feel exactly the way that the developers intended. The Morse code signals from Fallout 3's radio towers, mentioned briefly in some guides but known to relatively few players in detail, are a layered system. Each tower broadcasts a unique Morse code message, and decoding those messages reveals the locations of hidden supply caches. But two of the towers broadcast something more than coordinates. One broadcasts the recorded voice of a father who is trying to find medicine for his sick son. He is leaving a message into the empty air, hoping that someone who has medical supplies will find and respond to his transmission. Following the signal to its source reveals that no one ever responded. The father found nothing, or found something that was not medicine, or never found anything at all. The cache at the source is small, a few medical supplies, a gesture toward what he was looking for. Whether he ever came back for it is not addressed. There is no further entry. The broadcast just continues, into the empty sky, a distress call that has been running since before the player was ever born into this world. Vault 75, the eugenics experiment beneath Malden Middle School, has a detail in its records that most players miss. The educational records of the children who were evaluated and found deficient enough to be marked for elimination do not simply show failed test scores. They show the kinds of assessments that any normal school would produce. Notes from teachers about personality, about learning styles, about individual children's strengths and challenges. One record describes a child as having exceptional empathy and creative problem-solving ability, but poor performance on the physical conditioning metrics, and as therefore not suitable for advancement. The child is noted as having been disposed of. The contrast between the warmth of the teacher's observation and the clinical language of the disposition decision is the entire horror of the vault in miniature. The ghost at the Grantchester Mystery Mansion in Nuka World is one of the franchise's more carefully built supernatural elements. The mansion was a haunted house attraction before the war, one of the themed entertainment options at the Nuka World Resort. It is still a haunted house by the time the player arrives, in the sense that there is apparently a spirit inhabiting it. A little girl's silhouette is visible in an upper window before you enter. Inside, glimpses of her appear in peripheral vision. The pre-war detective's holotapes, left in various locations throughout the mansion, document his investigation of reported supernatural activity there and his increasingly disturbed response to the evidence that something was genuinely wrong with the space, something that had nothing to do with attraction theming. The Dunwich Building's inaccessible room, reachable through a specific and non-obvious sequence involving a child's toy in a corner of the building, contains a holotape that provides additional context for the cult's activities without completing the picture. Most players never find the room. The information in the holotape exists for the few who do, a detail of narrative depth that will never be encountered in most playthroughs but that rewards the attention of the players who give it. The developer testing room in Fallout 76 became famous for reasons that are almost perfectly ironic given the nature of what it contained. The room, as in most Bethesda games, contained every single item in the game, a necessary convenience for developers who need to test specific objects and encounters without running through the entire game to reach them. In a single-player game, this is a development tool with no implications for fairness or balance. In Fallout 76, which is a live service game with player-to-player interaction, the developer room contained an economy-breaking quantity of rare resources and items. When players discovered a method for reaching it without console commands, Bethesda reached out to the players who had accessed it and asked them, in exchange for possible account reactivation after bans, to explain how they had done it. The debugging tool designed to make development easier had created a security incident in the released game. Part 11. Fan theories and the questions. The lore leaves open deliberate gaps in the story. The Fallout community has developed, over the decades of the franchise's existence, an exceptionally sophisticated approach to close reading the game's lore, and the development teams have consistently embedded more information in the environmental details and background materials of these games than most players will ever encounter, information that the theorizing community finds and develops into frameworks that sometimes turn out to align closely with what the developers actually intended. The most persistent and most carefully argued fan theory about Fallout 4 concerns the nature of the Soul Survivor themselves. The Synth Soul Survivor theory holds that the player character who emerges from Vault 111 is not the original pre-war veteran who was frozen in cryosleep 210 years earlier, but a Gen 3 synth replacement created by the Institute, implanted with that person's memories, and released into the Commonwealth in a state of manufactured urgency designed to serve purposes the Institute has arranged in advance. The evidence assembled for this theory is substantial. The Institute is demonstrated, conclusively, to be capable of creating Gen 3 synths so complete that the synths themselves cannot detect their own artificial nature. The Vault's cryopod records show timing inconsistencies in the pod openings that some analysts have read as evidence of access between the Soul Survivor's initial freezing and their eventual awakening. Father, the Institute director who is revealed to be the real Sean grown old, displays throughout the game a level of foreknowledge about the Soul Survivor's actions and choices that would be difficult to explain if he were simply observing remotely with the Institute's surveillance capabilities. And the structure of the main quest itself, which ultimately leads the player through every major faction in the Commonwealth before requiring a final choice, seems almost engineered to produce useful, comprehensive data about the region's political landscape, regardless of which choice is eventually made. Emile Pagliarulo, Bethesda's studio design director, when asked about this theory in the context of the Amazon television series release and the renewed public interest in Fallout lore it generated, gave an answer that was carefully non-committal in exactly the way you would expect if the ambiguity were deliberate. He acknowledged the theory's existence and noted that the developers were aware of it, and he described the ambiguity in the game's design around this question as real and intentional, without confirming whether the Soul Survivor is or is not a synth. That answer, itself, is a Fallout answer. The most interesting questions are the ones that do not resolve cleanly. The question of who actually started the Great War has generated multiple theoretical frameworks, and the most interesting one does not center on either China or the United States, but on Vault-Tec itself. The argument is built from the information that the Amazon television series made explicit in its first season, which is that high-level Vault-Tec executives, in the period immediately before the war, were in explicit discussion about the strategic advantages of being the organization that survived a nuclear exchange. They had prepared for it. They had the Vault network, the offshore facilities, the experimental infrastructure. Without the war, all of that preparation served no purpose. With the war, Vault-Tec and the Enclave were positioned to be exactly what they claimed to be: the continuity of American civilization, the organization that had taken the necessary steps to ensure the species survived. The series stops short of confirming that Vault-Tec deliberately triggered the war. It goes further than the games had gone in making the argument that they had the motive, the preparation, and the capability. The community has noted that this is precisely the ambiguity the franchise favors, giving you enough information to construct the argument while declining to provide the confirmation that would close it. The Courier's identity in Fallout New Vegas is one of the franchise's most deliberately constructed mysteries. Unlike most Fallout protagonists, the Courier has a documented pre-game history that is referenced by multiple characters throughout the game and its DLC content. They were working a delivery route when the game begins. Before that, they have a history that includes events significant enough to have generated genuine enemies and genuine relationships. Ulysses, who appears first as a referenced character in the base game and then as the antagonist of the Lonesome Road DLC, has a personal grievance against the Courier that predates the game's events by years, centered on a delivery the Courier made that, in Ulysses's reading, destroyed the community he was living in. The Courier's relationship to that history, whether they knew what their delivery would cause, whether they had any relationship to Ulysses prior to the game, what their life looked like before the moment Benny's pistol fired, is something the game declines to specify. The blank slate protagonist is a standard RPG design choice, but in New Vegas it feels more carefully considered than usual, because the DLC content is clearly designed to suggest a specific history without confirming its details. Ulysses knows things about the Courier. He has strong feelings about them. The nature of those things and feelings is filtered through his own interpretive framework, which is not necessarily reliable. The player is left with the sense of a history they cannot access, a past that shaped them in ways they are not allowed to see. The survivalist storyline in Honest Hearts, the New Vegas DLC set in Zion Canyon, It is not a fan theory, but a piece of lore that is so completely hidden from players who do not specifically seek it out that it functions like one. Randall Clark, known in the game's present as the father in the cave of a local tribe's religious tradition, is a pre-war soldier who survived the Great War in Zion Canyon and spent the following decades watching over a community of children who had sheltered there. His story is told entirely through holotapes scattered across the canyon, recording his observations and feelings across decades of solitary guardianship. The holotapes are organized chronologically and span from the immediate aftermath of the war to Clark's death from radiation sickness decades later. They document his mental and physical state, his evolving relationship to the community he was protecting without their full knowledge, his faith, his doubt, his loneliness, and the specific texture of what it meant to spend your life in service to something without ever being acknowledged as the thing you actually were. By the time the player finds the last of the tapes, they have assembled a complete and genuinely moving portrait of a person who will never appear in the game as a character. The tribe he protected has become the Sorrows, and their mythology includes a figure called the Father in the Cave, who protected them in the ancient past. Clark died without knowing he would be remembered that way. He would probably have been pleased. Part 12. What was lost cut content, the sounds of the wasteland, and the stories left in the margins. Every game of sufficient ambition ends up with a graveyard of content that was built and then removed, of design decisions that were reversed, of ideas that made it through to implementation and then got cut in the final weeks for performance reasons or timeline constraints or because the direction of the project changed. In most games, this graveyard is invisible to players. In Fallout, it is recoverable. The community's combination of technical skill and obsessive interest in the franchise means that most of what was cut from Fallout games has been documented, analyzed, and in many cases partially restored through mods. Fallout New Vegas has the richest documented history of cut content in the franchise, which is both a tribute to the ambition of Obsidian's project and a consequence of the brutal 18-month development window they were given. The game shipped with an extraordinary amount of content given its timeline, but the gap between what was shipped and what was planned is enormous, and the pre-release build recovered in late 2025 from an Xbox 360 development kit confirmed what the community had suspected from years of examining game files. Ulysses, the character who eventually became one of the most discussed in the franchise, was designed to be a companion character in the base game. The logic of his story, the history between him and the courier, the specific grievance that motivates his role in Lonesome Road, was meant to develop across the length of a full companion relationship rather than being delivered primarily in the isolated DLC context. Files in the recovered build reference his intended placement at Wolfhorn Ranch, near the caravan ambush site at the game's beginning. The player would have encountered him early, had the option to recruit him, and spent dozens of hours traveling with someone whose complex and ultimately hostile relationship to the courier was being built in real time through dialogue and observed behavior. His removal was almost certainly a decision forced by the timeline rather than a creative choice. Making a companion's arc work properly requires an enormous amount of dialogue, event flagging, reactivity to the player's choices, and the specific kind of testing that catches problems in long-form relationship content. 18 months was not enough time to complete that work to the standard that New Vegas's writing demanded. Ulysses was taken out of the base game and moved entirely to DLC, which preserved his story but changed its nature. Lonesome Road is an explicitly confrontational piece of content, framed around a final reckoning, rather than the slower development of a relationship over time that the companion version would have allowed. The character Marilyn, one of Mr. House's Securitrons, appeared in the recovered pre-release build with full voice acting and visual design. She was styled after Marilyn Monroe and positioned in the Lucky 38's penthouse alongside Victor, providing a complement to the retro glamour aesthetic of House's pre-war personality. She was removed from the retail release, the consensus explanation being performance limitations on console hardware that made keeping her in the final build impractical. The restored Marilyn mod, built from the recovered pre-release data and released by modders in the weeks following the build's discovery, gives players who want to experience the intended version of that space the ability to do so. There was a planned Great Khan's questline that would have allowed the courier to formally join the tribe, gated behind an unarmed combat challenge against a tribe member. The files for this questline exist in the game's data in a non-functional state, their triggers removed but their underlying structure intact. A courier with formal Great Khan's membership would have had specific implications for every interaction with the tribe and with the factions that have complicated relationships with the Khans, including the NCR and Caesar's Legion. The quest was clearly far enough along in development to leave substantial traces, and its absence is felt in the way the Khan storyline in the retail release feels slightly incomplete despite its genuine quality. Freeside was significantly reduced from its planned scale. The concept art and the zoning structure in the game's data suggest an intention to create a single, continuous urban zone that felt like a real district of New Vegas, populated with significantly more NPCs and with enough visual density to communicate the lived character of a neighborhood. The shipped version is divided into 2 zones with a loading screen between them, the NPC population is reduced, and the density of activity is lower than the concept materials suggest was intended. Again, console memory constraints are the most frequently cited cause. The free side that players encounter in New Vegas is good. The free side that might have existed with more time and more hardware capacity is an interesting question. The ambient storytelling of the wasteland, the content that is present in the shipped games and functions as the primary narrative layer for most of the world's social history, is worth extended consideration because it is one of the things Fallout does better than almost any other franchise in games. Every room in a Fallout game has a story. Not a stated story, not a quest with a beginning and a journal entry and a completion notification. Just evidence. A skeleton in a bathtub, a collection of drawings pinned to the wall of an elementary school, a refrigerator with food inside from 200 years ago. A terminal entry from someone who did not know they were writing something that would be read 2 centuries after their death. The way these details are distributed across the wasteland's environments produces, when experienced over the course of a long playthrough, an accumulative emotional effect that individual pieces would not achieve on their own. Any single skeleton or holotape is a specific thing. Hundreds of them, encountered across dozens of hours of exploration, build a picture of a world that was genuinely inhabited by people with names and families and preoccupations and fears, people who were in the middle of specific days when the world ended, and left evidence of those days scattered across the landscape. The Switchboard, the Defense Intelligence Agency facility buried beneath the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, contains terminal entries from agents who were working on the morning of October 23, 2077. The entries begin in the Professional Register of Intelligence Work, documenting threat assessments and status updates on the escalating crisis with China. As the entries move forward in time across that morning, the Professional Register begins to shift. Personal details emerge. Someone received a message that their family made it into a vault. The last entry from that agent is very short. They write, primarily, about relief. The relief is so specific and so complete, written by someone who was almost certainly not going to make it themselves, that it is difficult to read in the context of what you know happened next. The water dripping in the tunnels under Diamond City, the wind moving through the collapsed sections of the elevated highway in the Boston suburbs, the ambient creak of rusted infrastructure settling in the night, the particular silence that falls in certain locations when the music stops and there is nothing except the sounds of the wasteland itself. These are not incidental. The sound design of the Fallout games is a form of storytelling, one that operates below the level of explicit narrative, and that shapes the emotional experience of moving through these environments in ways that are difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss when you are paying attention. The radio stations are part of this too, and they deserve more attention than they usually receive in discussions of Fallout's design. Three Dog on Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is not just background music. He is a narrative perspective, commenting on the lone wanderer's actions, updating his understanding of events in the wasteland based on the player's choices, maintaining a specific voice and worldview that interacts with the game's events rather than simply soundtracking them. His cheerful, slightly performative optimism, maintained in a city that is actively falling apart around the radio tower, is both funny and specifically sad in the way that real courage under terrible conditions is sad. Mr. New Vegas, as we have discussed, is not a person. The warmth and the good humor and the apparent care for the listening audience are algorithmic outputs of a system that has been running for over 200 years. Knowing this changes the experience of listening to him, and Obsidian's decision not to reveal it until players specifically pursue it means that most players who complete New Vegas have formed a relationship with Mr. New Vegas without knowing what he is. The moment of discovery, when it comes, has a specific quality that is difficult to describe except to say that it is the kind of melancholy that comes from learning that something you trusted was not what you thought it was, and simultaneously discovering that knowing that does not actually change how you feel about it. The Enclave Radio in Fallout 3 broadcasts propaganda about the glorious return of the United States government, delivered with the full sincerity and production quality of a professional wartime broadcast. Most of it is false. The Enclave is not a legitimate government. It is not saving the people of the wasteland. Its intentions toward the wasteland's population involve that weaponized FEV rather than democratic restoration. But the broadcast sounds exactly the way such a broadcast should sound if it were genuine, and listening to it in the context of the wasteland it is addressed to produces a kind of vertigo, the sound of institution claiming authority it has not earned, in a voice so confident that the false claim sounds almost credible. All of this, the explicit lore, and the ambient storytelling, and the cut content, and the deliberate ambiguities, and the Easter eggs, and the Dunwich thread, and the synth question, and the vault experiments, and the Great War that no one can account for, with complete certainty, constitutes the Fallout universe in its full complexity. It is a franchise that rewards spending time with it more than any single playthrough can capture. The more you look at it, the more you find. And the more you find, the more the world feels like something that has its own weight and history and texture independent of any particular game. The best thing about it, in the end, might be the simplest thing. Beneath all the philosophical questions and the dark institutional history and the competing political philosophies of the Wasteland's factions, beneath the Dunwich horror and the synth question and the specific cruelty of the Vault experiments, the Fallout universe at its center is about people, not characters in the abstract. Specific people, with specific days and specific fears, and specific things they cared about. People who left terminal entries and holotapes in places where they did not expect anyone to look for 2 centuries. People who drew pictures and pinned them to walls and went to work, and loved their families and worried about the future. People who, for the most part, did not know what was coming until it arrived. The bombs fell on a Saturday morning while people were getting ready for the day. While parents were making breakfast and children were getting dressed, and someone was on the phone and someone was looking out the window at the sky, and someone was in the middle of a sentence they would never finish, that is the baseline of the Fallout universe. Everything else, the surviving and the rebuilding and the fracturing and the politics and the monsters and the experiments, grows from that baseline, from the specific weight of an ordinary morning that became the last morning of the old world. The Wasteland does not ask you to fix it. That would be too much to ask. It only asks you to walk through it slowly, to read the terminal entries, to pick up the holotapes, to stop in the doorway of a burned house and notice the family photographs still on the wall, charred at the edges but still there. To remember that someone hung those photographs there because they wanted the room to feel like home. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. There is something particular about sharing a dark, quiet corner of a fictional universe with people who love it as much as you do. If this kept you company tonight, or gave you something to think about while you drift off, leave a like. Subscribe if you want more of this, because this world has more rooms to walk through and more stories to find. Sleep well. The Wasteland will still be there when you wake up. End of script. Part 13. The Brotherhood's Complicated Legacy from Founders to Inquisitors. The Brotherhood of Steel is, across all of its appearances in the franchise, the organization that best illustrates one of Fallout's central preoccupations: the way that a genuinely good founding idea can produce genuinely terrible outcomes when it is institutionalized, when the people who carry it forward are not the ones who had the original experience that generated it, and when the conditions that made the idea necessary have changed in ways the institution cannot fully process. Roger Maxon's original decision at Mariposa was a moral act. He encountered something wrong, he named it wrong, and he refused to continue participating in it. The secession, the march to Lost Hills, the founding of the Brotherhood, all of that grew from a single moment of a soldier deciding that following orders had limits and that he had reached those limits. That is a founding story that any organization would be proud of. What the Brotherhood built from that founding moment was, inevitably, more complicated. The original members had experienced the war directly. They understood what the FEV experiments had looked like from the inside. They had specific, concrete knowledge of what happened when advanced technology was placed in the hands of organizations that were willing to use it without ethical constraint. Their commitment to controlling that technology was grounded in direct observation of what happened when it was not controlled. Their children had heard the story, their grandchildren had heard the story from their parents. By the third and fourth and fifth generation of Brotherhood membership, the Codex was not a record of lived experience, but a set of doctrinal commitments inherited from ancestors who were by then mythologized rather than remembered as fallible human beings. The specific context that generated the Brotherhood's founding rules had faded. The rules remained. This is how institutions work, and the Brotherhood is among the franchise's most carefully observed examples of institutional dynamics. The Codex prohibits the Brotherhood from sharing technology with outsiders. The original logic of this prohibition was about preventing exactly the kind of weaponization that produced the Resource Wars and the Great War. The institutional application of that prohibition, stripped of its original context, produces a Brotherhood that hoards food synthesizers and medical technology and water purification equipment that the wastelanders around them desperately need and will not share it because sharing technology with outsiders is against the Codex. The Lions chapter in the capital Wasteland is interesting precisely because it represents an elder who looked at that institutional logic and concluded that the original intent of the Codex was being betrayed by its current application. Owen Lyons was not abandoning the Brotherhood's core values when he decided to engage with and protect the civilian population. He was arguing, sincerely and with some sophistication, that the Brotherhood's founding purpose, preventing another catastrophe, required active engagement with the people most at risk of that catastrophe, not isolation from them. The Brotherhood of Mariposa was born from the conviction that people were being harmed by technology misuse. Ignoring people being harmed was, by Lyon's logic, a betrayal of that conviction. His chapter of the Brotherhood was unusual in another respect. The Lost Hills Bunker and the Citadel in the capital Wasteland maintained contact and a formal relationship, but the ideological divergence between Lyon's approach and the standard Brotherhood doctrine created a genuine schism. The Brotherhood's central leadership considered Lyon's chapter to be in deviation. Resources and reinforcements that would normally flow to a Brotherhood chapter in active operations were withheld. Lyons was operating without the full institutional support he should have had, a circumstance that contributed to the attrition his chapter suffered against the super mutant threat and the Enclave both. After the events of Fallout 3's base game and the Broken Steel DLC, with the Enclave's presence in the capital Wasteland significantly reduced and the super mutant threat degraded by years of Brotherhood military action, the Lyons chapter was in a position to do what no Brotherhood chapter had ever convincingly done: actually rebuild something. They had relationships with civilian communities. They had respect and goodwill that the Brotherhood's hoarding reputation usually prevented. They had eliminated or significantly damaged the most acute threats to the region's stability. What they chose to do with that position is something Fallout 4 does not directly address, but the situation in the Commonwealth 200 years north and a decade later provides some indirect evidence about what happened to the Brotherhood's East Coast operations in the intervening period. Arthur Maxson, who leads the Brotherhood in Fallout 4, is presented as a restoration of traditional Brotherhood values rather than a continuation of the Lyons deviations. He is also presented as young, in a way that is significant. Maxson rose to leadership of his chapter at an extraordinarily young age, following the deaths of the senior members of his unit in circumstances related to the events briefly described in the Fallout 4 lore. He was, when he assumed command, too young to have accumulated the kind of experience that might have produced nuance in his application of Brotherhood doctrine. What he had was conviction, tactical intelligence, genuine charisma, and an ideology that was clear enough to organize a military force around. The Brotherhood of Fallout 4 under Maxson is effective. It is efficient. It has solved the attrition problem that plagued the Lyons chapter by building a larger, better resourced operation with stronger institutional continuity. And it has done so by being very clear about what it is willing to do. The airship Prydwen, which arrives over the Commonwealth as the game's most dramatic faction introduction, is a genuine military power projection capability. The Brotherhood that lands with it has the equipment and the organization to reshape the Commonwealth's power dynamics. What Elder Maxson has decided the Brotherhood should do with that capability includes the destruction of the Institute and the destruction of the Railroad, and the containment or elimination of the Commonwealth's super mutant population. These are, each of them, arguable as priorities. The Institute is genuinely dangerous. The Railroad's activities complicate the Brotherhood's ability to account for synth movement in the region. The super mutant problem is a real problem. But the specific way that Maxon pursues these goals, with a certainty that leaves no room for the consideration of competing moral frameworks, produces consequences that the game carefully shows you, even if it does not editorialize about them. Paladin Dance's story is the most pointed of those consequences, but it is not the only one. The Brotherhood's approach to the wasteland communities they encounter, the way they communicate authority rather than cooperation, the way their resource demands function more like taxation from an occupying power than trade between partners, the specific casual dismissal with which Brotherhood personnel treat surface civilians who are not of immediate use to them, all of this is observable in the game, and all of it speaks to what an institution that was founded to protect people looks like when it has spent enough generations replacing the people with the doctrine. Part 14. Nuka World and the Economics of Post-Apocalyptic Nostalgia. Nuka World, the Fallout 4 DLC set in a massive fictional theme park based on the franchise's Nuka-Cola brand, is at first glance the lightest content in the franchise, the entry most clearly designed as entertainment rather than lore delivery. It is also, when examined with some attention, a surprisingly coherent piece of commentary on exactly what it is ostensibly being, a celebration of pre-war consumer culture, the specific brand of cheerful, relentless marketing optimism that characterized Fallout's America right up until the moment the bombs fell. The Nuka-Cola brand in Fallout has always been more than a background detail. It is the franchise's most concentrated expression of the pre-war aesthetic. The rounded logo, the red and white color scheme, the advertising language that never varies from its register of bright, accessible, slightly aggressive cheerfulness. Nuka-Cola was everywhere in pre-war America. It was the beverage of a civilization, and Nuka World was, in the pre-war timeline, the ultimate expression of that brand's willingness to take its consumer relationship to its logical endpoint. An entire theme park built around the experience of consuming and celebrating a soft drink. The park still exists in the post-war wasteland. The rides still run in some cases. The decorations still occupy their designed positions. The costumed Nuka mascots, automated robots in character suits, still patrol certain areas of the park. And all of this should be straightforwardly ruins, the way the rest of the pre-war world is ruins, architectural evidence of a civilization that does not exist anymore. Except that the brand still has power. The Nuka-Cola imagery still works on the people who encounter it, evoking something in the cultural memory of a population that grew up in vaults or in wasteland communities, where the brand's omnipresence in pre-war artifacts has made it familiar even to people born generations after the last bottle was produced. The raider gangs that control Nuka World by the time the player arrives are using the park's structure as both a literal territory and a kind of ironic stage set, their violence and their economies of force conducted against the backdrop of smiling Nuka mascots and cheerful advertising copywriting that has not changed in 200 years. The combination is disturbing in a specific way that the game plays for dark humor rather than straightforward horror, but the underlying observation is real. The aesthetics of consumer capitalism are extraordinarily durable, outlasting the civilization that produced them, and they continue to generate meaning and desire in people who encounter them long after the conditions that made them make sense are gone. The secret backstory of Nuka World, available in terminal entries and holotapes scattered across the park, is a corporate history of the kind that is only visible in retrospect. Nuka-Cola Corporation's pre-war operations were successful enough to attract the involvement of various government programs interested in the company's research into food chemistry and artificial colorings and flavorings, some of which were being developed with potential military applications. The corporation's relationship with certain government agencies, including ones that were connected to the Enclave's planning for the post-war period, is hinted at in ways that suggest the brand's cheerfulness was, at its highest corporate levels, covering over some of the same darkness that covered everything in pre-war America. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the electric blue variety that glows in the dark and has been used throughout the franchise as a collectible and a currency and a crafting ingredient, turns out in Nuka World's lore to have gotten its distinctive glow from a strontium-90 additive, which is a mildly radioactive element. The quantum variety was introduced late in the pre-war period and had a very limited distribution, partly because the formula was still being finalized, and partly because certain elements of the safety testing had produced results that warranted further review before full distribution. The game plays this for humor, but strontium-90 is a genuine radioactive isotope, a byproduct of nuclear fission reactions, and the specific idea that the pre-war corporation was putting radioactive ingredients in consumer beverages is consistent with the franchise's broader picture of a civilization that had become so normalized to nuclear technology that its dangers had largely stopped being legible as dangers. Part 15. The Mojave Desert and its deep history. What the wasteland remembers. The specific landscape of Fallout New Vegas, the Mojave Desert and its environs in what was once Nevada, California, and Arizona, is not a neutral setting. The real Mojave Desert has its own deep history, its own geology of ancient lakebeds and mineral deposits, and human habitation going back thousands of years, its own specific relationship to American military history and nuclear weapons development, and the game draws on all of that in ways that reward some attention. The Nevada test site, where the United States conducted above-ground nuclear weapons tests in the 1950s and 60s, is visible from Las Vegas. Families would drive out to watch the tests, which were promoted as impressive public spectacles. The mushroom clouds were visible from casino rooftops on the Strip. The specific cultural relationship between Las Vegas and nuclear testing, between entertainment and apocalyptic spectacle, between consumer capitalism and existential risk, is part of the real historical context of the place, and it is part of what the Fallout universe is drawing on when it uses Las Vegas as its setting. The Hoover Dam, the game's central strategic object, is real. The real Hoover Dam was completed in 1936 and remains one of the largest hydroelectric power generation facilities in the United States. Its function as a water and power source for the American Southwest, and specifically for Las Vegas, is accurate to reality. The decision to make it the focal point of the conflict between the NCR, Caesar's Legion, and Mr. House is not arbitrary. Whoever controls the Hoover Dam controls the most critical piece of infrastructure in the entire region, the one that determines whether any of the surrounding settlements can function at the scale they need to function. The geography of the Mojave, the way the mountains contain the valley, the specific experience of desert distances, and the mirages that make them feel larger and stranger than they are, the way the heat and the exposure change your relationship to open space, all of this is present in the game's environmental design in ways that contribute to the specific feeling of New Vegas as distinct from Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland or Fallout 4's Commonwealth. The Mojave is not just a different region, it is a different relationship to landscape, and the game conveys that. The tribes of the Mojave, the Great Khans and the Boomers and the Fiends, and the other groups that the courier encounters across the game's map are not simply post-war bandits with different aesthetics. Each of them carries a specific history, a specific story of how they came to be what they are, that rewards investigation. The Great Khans, in particular, have a history that connects directly back to the events of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, the first games in the franchise, making them one of the longest-running continuous narrative threads in the series. Their trajectory from a violent raider gang to a complex tribal group with genuine culture and political awareness, capable of being either an obstacle or an ally, depending on the player's approach, is one of New Vegas's quieter accomplishments. The Boomers, isolated at Nellis Air Force Base, represent a different post-war trajectory, a group that salvaged military hardware and expertise, that built a genuine internal culture around both, and that has maintained its isolation through a willingness to use the hardware on anyone who approaches without permission. They are insular and xenophobic in ways that have made their survival possible, and they are simultaneously fascinating precisely because their isolation has allowed them to maintain skills and technology that everywhere else in the Mojave has been lost. Getting them to engage with the outside world, if the player chooses to pursue that questline, requires understanding what they are afraid of and why, rather than simply what they want. Part 16. Fallout 76 and the Origin Story. 25 years after the bombs. Fallout 76 occupies a unique position in the franchise's timeline and in its reception history. Released in 2018 to a critical response that focused heavily on its technical problems and its departure from the single-player narrative format that had defined the franchise's best-received entries, it has over subsequent years developed a more substantial player base and a more nuanced critical reputation. as Bethesda has updated and expanded it significantly. From a lore perspective, 76 is genuinely valuable. It is the only entry in the franchise set in the immediate post-war period, only 25 years after the bombs fell rather than the century or two that other games use as their starting point. This means Appalachia, the game's West Virginia setting, still shows the war in a way that later games cannot. Buildings are not ruins yet. They are damaged structures, still recognizable as what they were. The landscape has been irradiated but not transformed in the way that centuries of mutation and ecological succession have transformed the landscapes of other games. The people and the institutions of the pre-war period are still within living memory, not yet entirely mythologized. The vaults of Appalachia that the game explores are mostly different from those encountered in other games, because Vault 76, the game's central vault, is one of the genuine control vaults, designed to open on schedule and release its population to begin the process of reclamation. The people who emerge from Vault 76 on Reclamation Day are not test subjects of a cruel experiment in the way that the populations of most other vaults were. They are, at least nominally, what the advertising said vault dwellers would be, people emerging to help rebuild. What they find in Appalachia, though, is a region already in the process of being consumed by a new crisis. The Scorched Plague, spreading from mutated creatures called Scorch Beasts, is turning the region's survivors and animals into mindless, hostile Scorched, and the outbreak is threatening to spread beyond Appalachia. The 76 Vault dwellers arrive to find that the work of reclamation they were prepared for has been replaced by the more urgent work of preventing a biological catastrophe. The Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, encountered in terminal entries and holotapes across the region, rather than as active NPCs in the base game, provides one of the franchise's more detailed accounts of how the Brotherhood operated in the immediate post-war period, before the organization had fully consolidated its doctrine and its hierarchy. The Appalachian Brotherhood chapter was established by refugees from the main organization who had made it east before or shortly after the war, and their development under the conditions of Appalachia's specific post-war chaos tells a story about institution building under crisis conditions that is different from, but complementary to, the West Coast origin story. The Enclave presence in 76, specifically an Enclave faction that survived in an Appalachian bunker complex, shows the organization in an earlier state than any of its game appearances prior to this one. The Enclave of Fallout 2 is a polished, organized, confident conspiracy with decades of post-war institutional development behind it. The Appalachian Enclave of 76 is a group of survivors managing the shock of the war while trying to maintain their institutional identity and their long-term planning, and the documents they leave behind show the gap between their self-image as the legitimate continuation of the American government and the more complicated reality of their actual situation. The culture of Appalachian communities before their destruction, documented through holotapes and environmental evidence throughout the game, is one of 76's genuine achievements. West Virginia's specific regional culture, its music and its food traditions, and its relationship to the land and to coal mining, and to the particular mix of rural community values that characterized Appalachian life, is present in the game's environmental design in ways that give the wasteland a texture distinct from other regions. The White Spring Resort, the Watauga Smart City, the Pioneer Scouts camp system, the radio towers and the church basements and the roadside restaurants, all of them carry evidence of specific pre-war communities that had specific characters and specific histories before the bombs ended them. Part 17. The Psychology of the Wasteland. Why people do what they do in a broken world. One of the things that distinguishes the best Fallout content from the merely competent variety is its interest in the psychological dimensions of surviving catastrophe. The Wastelanders the player encounters are not simply obstacles or quest givers. They are people whose psychology has been shaped by specific conditions that the franchise understands well enough to depict with some accuracy. The psychology of scarcity is one of the organizing principles of post-war society. When basic necessities are genuinely uncertain, when food and water and medical care are available in unpredictable quantities and at high cost, the cognitive and behavioral patterns that scarcity produces become dominant. People's planning horizons shorten. Immediate threats are prioritized over long-term investments. Social trust contracts because every other person is a potential competitor for the same limited resources. The specific forms that violence takes in the wasteland are not random or generic, but reflect the particular pressures of a resource-scarce environment where the institutions that normally maintain social order are absent or weak. The raider groups that appear in essentially every Fallout game are often read as simple enemies, obstacles to be cleared from locations that the player wants to access. The better-written raider content, though, presents them as comprehensible responses to the specific conditions of the wasteland. People join raider groups because raider groups can protect them and feed them, because the alternative is the more exposed and more dangerous position of an unaffiliated individual in a landscape full of people who have also been forced into violent solutions by the same conditions. The specific hierarchy and culture of different raider organizations reflects the specific conditions and personalities of their formation. The Nuka World Raiders, who are the central feature of that DLC, are organized into 3 distinct gangs with different aesthetics and different internal cultures, and the differences are not arbitrary. The Disciples are defined by cruelty as a value in itself, a culture that has elevated the infliction of pain into something approaching a religious practice, which is what happens in certain closed social systems when trauma goes unaddressed for long enough, and the group needs a way to convert its members' suffering into something that feels like power. The operators are pragmatists, organized around economic logic, treating violence as a tool for profit rather than an end in itself, which is a different but equally legible post-war adaptation. The pack is organized around performance, around identity as spectacle, around the specific human need to belong to something that has an aesthetic and a story. All 3 are responses to the same underlying conditions, and all 3 are recognizable as human responses to those conditions. The companions in the various Fallout games, the characters who travel with the player and who can be engaged in extended dialogue about their histories and beliefs, are the most developed examples of how the franchise handles individual psychology. Nick Valentine's melancholy, his specific way of holding the gap between the pre-war man whose memories he carries and the post-war machine he actually is, reflects something real about the experience of inherited trauma and identity formation under impossible conditions. Boone's PTSD, his inability to escape the specific event at Bitter Springs that defines his guilt, his need for targets, and the particular relief that violence provides him, and its failure to actually resolve anything, is a portrait of combat trauma that is accurate to how that experience actually works. Deacon's reflexive deception, his inability to be honest even when honesty would serve him better, is a survival adaptation that has calcified into a personality trait, the way that adaptive behaviors often do. The faction leaders of New Vegas are psychological portraits as much as political positions. Caesar's ideology is comprehensible as the product of a specific intellectual history combined with a specific personality. A scholar who learned from ancient Rome that strength and unity were the preconditions for civilization, and who had the specific combination of intelligence and self-belief necessary to act on that learning at scale. Mr. House's detachment is the product of specific conditions: extended isolation, the experience of operating through intermediaries for over 2 centuries, the gradual attrition of the direct human experience that would otherwise moderate his more abstract tendencies. President Kimball of the NCR is the portrait of a politician whose democratic legitimacy has not produced wisdom, who has access to all the information a leader would need and still makes bad decisions because the institutional pressures of democratic politics reward different things than good decisions do. Part 18. The radio and what it means: music, propaganda, and memory in the wasteland. The radio in Fallout games does something that is deceptively simple and actually quite sophisticated. It fills the silence of the wasteland with sound, and the sound it fills it with is specifically pre-war music, jazz standards, and boogie-woogie, and the particular style of mid-century American popular music that reflects the aesthetic of the era the Fallout universe was frozen in. Ella Fitzgerald, the Ink Spots, Bob Crosby, Billie Holiday. Music that most players encountering it in the context of a post-apocalyptic game will not have deep prior associations with, music that is therefore primarily associated, for the duration of their playthrough, with the wasteland itself. This creates a specific emotional effect. The music is simultaneously nostalgic and present, simultaneously a connection to the world before the bombs, and a constant reminder that that world is gone. Hearing someone to watch over me while walking through the ruins of Washington, D.C. See or hearing way back home while crossing the Mojave Desert is an experience that operates on a different register from the game's explicit narrative content. The music does not tell you how to feel about the wasteland. It creates a feeling by existing there, by insisting on its presence in a landscape that seems to have no room for it. The choice to use pre-war music was clearly deliberate, and it was clearly connected to the broader project of maintaining the franchise's aesthetic identity as a retro-futuristic post-apocalypse, rather than a generically dark dystopian wasteland. But the music choice has an additional function that is easy to overlook. It is documentation. The music was created in the world before the bombs, by people who had no knowledge of what was coming, who were making art in the ordinary conditions of their specific historical moment. Hearing it in the context of the wasteland is, among other things, hearing evidence of what the world was like when it was whole. Not propaganda evidence, not corporate cheerfulness, but actual artistic production from actual people who were living their lives. Three Dog's broadcasting style in Fallout 3, the specific combination of genuine commitment to his news role and performance of optimism that his difficult circumstances do not quite justify, is modeled on a recognizable real-world type. The community radio DJ, whose local knowledge and personal investment in their community give their work a quality that national broadcasting cannot replicate. He knows the capital wasteland. He knows its geography and its settlements and its people, or as many of them as his network of contacts can reach. He updates his coverage of the lone wanderer's actions in ways that demonstrate both his access to information and his own interpretive framework, which does not always align with the player's self-understanding. The Enclave radio that broadcasts alongside Three Dog Station is exactly what it needs to be to work dramatically, completely sincere in its delivery and completely false in its content. The voice of the Enclave's radio presenter is professional and authoritative. The production quality is better than anything Galaxy News Radio can manage, and the content is propaganda designed to make the Enclave's operations sound like the legitimate activities of a government in the process of responsibly restoring order. Everything about the broadcast says trustworthy, and nothing about the broadcast is true. The contrast between form and content is the entire point, and it is made without editorializing, letting the player observe both the broadcast and the Enclave's actual activities and draw their own conclusions. Part 19. What comes after Fallout 5 and the future of the franchise? Bethesda confirmed in mid-2025 that Fallout 5 is in active development, along with remasters of both Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, with Obsidian Entertainment returning to work on a future Fallout project under Bethesda's direction. The details of any of these projects are extremely limited at the time of writing, and any specific claims about their content would be speculation rather than fact. What the available information does suggest is that the franchise's future will draw from the foundations that have made it significant across nearly 30 years of games. The alternate history setting, the Vault experiments, the faction politics, the ambient storytelling, the moral complexity that refuses clean resolutions, and the specific emotional register that comes from exploring a world where the worst has already happened, and people are trying to figure out what comes next. The Amazon television series, which premiered in 2024 and released its second season in late 2025, has expanded the franchise's reach significantly and has introduced a large new audience to the world's lore through the story of Lucy McLean, the ghoul formerly known as Cooper Howard, and Maximus of the Brotherhood of Steel. The series is set in 2296, the furthest forward in the canonical timeline of any Fallout content, and it has made canonical decisions that affect the established lore. The NCR's Shady Sands was destroyed by a nuclear bomb shortly after the events of Fallout New Vegas, changing the established trajectory of that faction's development in ways that some long-term fans found difficult to accept and that the franchise's lore now has to accommodate. The show's development of Vault-Tec's pre-war planning, showing executives an explicit discussion of the advantages of surviving a nuclear exchange they have been preparing for, is the most direct statement the franchise has ever made about the institution's role in the catastrophe. The games had always implied that the Enclave and Vault-Tec had known what was coming and had prepared accordingly. The show makes the darker implication that knowing and preparing was only one step removed from wanting, and that the Vault program was always as much about control and research as it was about survival. The community's response to the show has been, characteristically, A combination of genuine enthusiasm for what it does well and careful, detailed engagement with the places where it diverges from established lore. This is the Fallout community doing what it does. Close reading the available evidence, maintaining the conversation about what the world is and what it means, extending the universe through the specific intelligence and care that it has always brought to the material. Part 20. The final theory: what if everything the Vaults produced was meant to happen? There is a reading of the Fallout universe that takes all of the Vault experiments and all of the FEV research and all of the Enclave's post-war planning and sees not a series of separate institutional projects but a single, continuous program designed before the war and continuing after it toward an end goal that the available evidence only partially illuminates. The evidence, assembled, Vault-Tec built the Vaults as experiments because the Enclave needed data on isolated human populations over extended periods. The data was designed to inform the planning for a generation ship that would evacuate the Enclave and selected others to another world. The FEV research was designed, in part, to produce biological modifications that would make the eventual colonists better suited to the alien environments they might encounter. The Vault experiments that tested physical endurance, psychological resilience, resource management under stress, all of that is potentially relevant to the project of long-duration space travel. This reading suggests that the catastrophe was not an accident that Vault-Tec and the Enclave prepared for, but a project they were participants in. That the bombs falling on October 23, 2077 were not an interruption of the Enclave's plans, but the execution of them. That the whole of post-war wasteland history has been shaped by the needs of an organization that never intended to live in it permanently. The problem with this reading is that the Enclave, as encountered in both Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, does not behave like an organization that is successfully executing a long-term plan. In Fallout 2, they are using FEV as a weapon to clear the surface, rather than as a research tool for eventual colonization. In Fallout 3, they are trying to poison the water supply. Neither of these behaviors is consistent with an organization carefully nurturing the surface population as a data source for a generation ship project. They look more like an organization that has abandoned the original plan and is now simply trying to eliminate everyone who is not them. One interpretation is that the generation ship plan failed, that the specific technical obstacles proved insurmountable, and that the Enclave's increasingly genocidal behavior in the games is the behavior of an organization that has lost its long-term purpose and has fallen back on its ideological framework, the purity and legitimacy convictions, as an end in itself rather than a means to something else. The Enclave that wants to kill everyone who has been touched by radiation is not an organization with a plan. It is an organization that has nothing left but contempt. Another interpretation is that the generation ship plan is ongoing, that what appears in the games is only the visible portion of a much larger program, and that somewhere in the Fallout universe there is infrastructure and planning, and perhaps a vessel that the games have not yet found a reason to show us. The franchise has been careful to leave this possibility open, neither confirming the ship's existence nor definitively ruling it out. The terminal entries and holotapes that reference it are consistent with it having been a real project. Whether it succeeded is a question the franchise may eventually choose to answer. This is the quality of the Fallout universe's mysteries that makes them worth spending time with. They are not puzzles with clean solutions waiting to be found. They are the kind of questions that open onto more questions, that reward continued attention without producing the specific satisfaction of resolution. The best Fallout mysteries are the ones where the more you know, the more interesting the unknown becomes. The generation ship is one of those. The Dunwich Horror is one of those. The question of who fired first is one of those. The Wasteland keeps its secrets. It has had 200 years to decide which ones to share, and it is not finished with the conversation. End of full script. Part 21. Specific stories worth knowing: the individual tragedies hidden in the Wasteland. The Fallout universe communicates its most affecting emotional content not through cutscenes or dramatic revelations, but through the accumulation of small, specific stories, recoverable through patient exploration and the willingness to read everything you find. These are not side quests with markers and objectives. They are the kind of story that only emerges when you have spent enough time in a particular room that you start to notice what is in it. The story of Phyllis Daly, whose holotape is found in Fallout 3 near the Springvale School, is one of these. She was a schoolteacher who survived the Great War and continued teaching a group of children in the ruins of a school, doing her best to maintain normal educational routines in circumstances where nothing was normal. Her holotapes document the challenges of this project in specific detail: the difficulty of finding materials, the trauma responses of the children she was working with, her own uncertainty about whether what she was doing was helping, or simply providing a fragile sense of normalcy that would eventually shatter anyway. She was trying. The attempt was genuine and clearly impractical, and she knew that, and she kept doing it. There is no resolution provided for her story. Whether she and her students survived, whether the school continued, whether the children she taught went on to do anything in particular with what she gave them, the wasteland does not say. The story of the survivalist, Randall Clark, which we discussed earlier, is perhaps the most complete and most affecting of these ambient narratives precisely because it is so thoroughly hidden. All 19 of his holotapes have to be specifically sought out across the broad landscape of Zion Canyon. They are not marked on any map. No character directs you toward them. You find them if you explore with enough patience. If you look in the crevices and on the ledges and in the caves that seem to dead end rather than continuing. And when you have found all of them, when you have assembled the complete account of Randall Clark's life in Zion, you have been told one of the franchise's best short stories, by a character you will never meet. His final tapes, from the years when his body was failing and he knew it, have a quality of hard-won peace that is rare in the franchise's emotional register. He does not claim to have achieved everything he intended. He does not suggest that the decades of solitary guardianship were sufficient redemption for whatever he had done before. He has done what he could do. The tribe he protected exists and will continue. He has been honest about both the limits and the genuine value of that. He dies in Zion Canyon and becomes a legend, which is not what he was trying for, but is what the world made of him. The terminal entries in the basement of the Wilson Adama Toys corporate headquarters in Fallout 4 tell the story of a toy company that received a government contract to manufacture military guidance systems hidden inside commercial toy products, the idea being that the civilian supply chain for toys would be a useful cover for weapons components. The people at Wilson Adama Toys who wrote those terminal entries understood exactly what they were doing, and they were not comfortable with it, and they did it anyway because the contract was worth more than their comfort. The specific language of their internal communications, the way they discuss the ethical questions in terms of market positioning and liability management rather than in terms of what was right, is very precise about how that kind of moral compromise actually works in institutional settings. The Fenn Street Sewer in Boston contains a story that is genuinely disturbing in the specific way that real crime stories are disturbing rather than the genre horror way of most Fallout's creepy content. A serial killer operated in pre-war Boston, using the sewer system to access victims and to display the results, and a detective was closing in on him before the war ended both their stories. The killer left the bodies arranged in specific positions with holotapes nearby, explaining his work in the particular register of someone who believes their violence is meaningful rather than simply violence. The detective's pursuit, documented through case file holotapes found across the sewer's extent, is detailed enough to reconstruct the investigative logic he was using. He had almost gotten there. The war ended the case before either the detective or the killer had reached their outcomes, and now they are both history, equally preserved and equally gone. The wedding that was interrupted at the Museum of Freedom in Concord, which is usually the first location players access in Fallout 4's main quest, is documented in a few holotapes that most players walk past without picking up. There was a couple who had planned to get married in the museum's historical exhibit space, which they had found charming in its way, before the bombs fell. The holotapes are the couple's pre-war voice messages to each other, arranging the final details of the ceremony, the kind of ordinary practical coordination that surrounds any planned event. The ceremony never happened. The messages are still there, in the ruins of the museum where the ceremony would have been, because no one had any reason to erase them. They are as complete a picture of an interrupted life as the franchise offers, precisely because they are so ordinary. The story of Maxon's captain, whose log entries appear in the Lost Hills bunker in Fallout 1, documents the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel from the perspective of one of Maxon's officers, someone who was not the leader and not the ideological driving force, but who understood what was happening and who chose to follow. His entries are careful and precise, reflecting a military training that valued accurate observation and clear documentation. They describe the march from Mariposa to Lost Hills in terms that are neither heroic nor despairing, just specific about the conditions and the decisions and the people involved. The founding of the Brotherhood, through his entries, is not a legendary act but a desperate practical choice made by a group of people who had nowhere else to go and who needed something to be and who happened to have a leader articulate enough to give them an identity. The Cabot family of Fallout 4, encountered in a questline that begins with finding a very specific poster in Diamond City, are one of the game's most deliberate pieces of lore architecture. The Cabots are a pre-war Boston family, still alive 210 years after the bombs fell, maintained in that state by a serum derived from the biological properties of an alien artifact that the family patriarch discovered in the Sahara Desert in the 1900s. Their longevity is real. The serum is real. The artifact from which it is derived is real. The questline, which involves the player in the family's complicated internal conflicts, ends with choices about the serum and the artifact that are deliberately left without a clearly right answer. What the Cabot questline adds to the Fallout universe, beyond its specific narrative content, is the suggestion that the aliens glimpsed in other parts of the franchise, particularly the alien blaster weapon that appears in multiple games, and the crashed alien spacecraft found in Fallout 3, are not simply Easter eggs or brief comic intrusions, but are connected to something in the universe's deep history. The artifact the Cabots found was not simply unusual technology. It was biological in its properties and extraordinary in its effects, in ways that suggest whoever or whatever created it understood human biology at a level that did not come from casual study. Whether there is a larger story about that, whether the aliens whose presence is hinted at across multiple games have a relationship to the Fallout universe's history that goes beyond scattered hardware left on crash sites, is something the franchise has not chosen to pursue in depth. The Cabot questline leaves the door open without walking through it. The Pickman's Gallery in Boston, a pre-war art gallery whose collection is still partially intact in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, contains evidence of a serial killer who was active before the war and who appears to have been active after it as well. The gallery's paintings, enormous canvases depicting scenes of raider violence in a style that is technically accomplished and thematically disturbing, were painted by the gallery's owner and apparent subject, a man named Pickman, who is encountered by the player in the basement of the gallery in the process of killing raiders. He is not hostile to the player. He is not presented as a villain in the conventional sense. He gives the player a key to his hidden safe as payment for not interfering with what he is doing. The paintings are extraordinary and wrong in specific ways that reward attention. The subjects are not fictional. The scenes depicted in the paintings are the scenes of violence that Pickman has witnessed or participated in, rendered with the technical skill of someone who had formal artistic training and the perspective of someone who finds beauty in things that other people experience as horror. He is an H.P. Lovecraft reference, specifically to the story Pickman's Model, whose protagonist discovers that the artist whose work he finds so compelling has been painting from direct observation of things that are not human. Whether Pickman's in Fallout is also painting from direct observation of something more than he appears to be is left to the player's interpretation. Part 22. The Wasteland at Night Atmosphere, Silence, and the Emotional Register of Exploration. There is a specific experience that most Fallout players will recognize, one that is difficult to fully articulate but that is among the franchise's most distinctive achievements. It is the experience of being somewhere in the wasteland at night, with the music off, moving through a landscape that is simultaneously recognizable as a version of the real world and utterly alien in its current state, and feeling the specific emotional weight of what that means. The Fallout games achieve this partly through their visual design, and partly through their sound design, and partly through the accumulated context that exploration builds over hours of play. After you have read enough terminal entries, after you have found enough holotapes, after you have spent enough time in rooms that are clearly still waiting for someone to come back who is never coming back, the wasteland stops being a backdrop and starts being a presence. The ruins have weight. The absence of the people who inhabited them is specific rather than generic. Walking through the ruins of Boston at night in Fallout 4, past the brownstones of Beacon Hill and the skeletal framework of what were once apartment buildings, with only the ambient sounds of the wind and the occasional distant gunfire and the particular creak of metal settling in the dark, produces an experience that is not exactly sad and not exactly frightening and is not comfortably categorized. It is the specific feeling of inhabiting a space that was designed for human beings and that currently lacks them, of moving through an architecture of human aspiration and ordinary life that has been emptied of the ordinary life it was built around. The buildings are still there. They are quite good buildings, in many cases, or were before 2 centuries of neglect and occasional violence. The families that lived in them are not. This is the emotional core of the Fallout franchise, the thing that makes it more than a game about shooting mutants in a nuclear wasteland. It is a franchise about what human beings build and what happens to what they build after they are gone, about the specific quality of the things that survive and the specific quality of the things that do not, about the way that the objects and the architecture and the records of everyday life continue to carry their original meaning long after the context that gave them meaning has been destroyed. The Mr. Handy robots that still maintain their routines in empty buildings are a particularly affecting version of this. A Mr. Handy that has been keeping a house clean for 200 years, that still greets you with the cheerfulness it was programmed to express, that still apologizes for any dust that might have accumulated in the upper floors, is doing exactly what it was designed to do. There is no one for it to do those things for. It continues anyway. Whether this is poignant or uncanny or both is a question that the game leaves to the individual player, and different players land in different places with it. Codsworth, the specific Mr. Handy encountered in Sanctuary Hills at the beginning of Fallout 4, has been maintaining the sole survivor's house for 210 years. He was a household appliance assigned to care for a family, and the family went into the vault, and the vault sealed, and he stayed, and the years passed, and he maintained the property as well as he could given the conditions. His cheerfulness, when he is reunited with the sole survivor, is not performed. It is the expression of a system that has been waiting for this outcome for over 2 centuries, that has continued its routine through all of that time in the specific hope, if hope is the right word for what a Mr. Handy experiences, that there would eventually be someone to do the routine for. He remembers the family. He remembers the specific details of the specific family he was assigned to care for. He will talk about Nora, the sole survivor's spouse, with genuine warmth, and his way of managing the grief of her death, never directly addressed but present in the way he talks around it, is one of the game's smallest and most human emotional achievements. He is not human. He is a household robot. He has been alone for 210 years. He is very glad you are back. The wasteland, at its best, is full of things like Codsworth, full of objects and systems and records that were designed for a world that no longer exists and that continue anyway, that maintain their function or their form or their data in conditions their creators never imagined, that are waiting, in whatever sense a thing can wait, for someone to find them and understand what they were. That is the Fallout universe, in the end. A world full of things that are still waiting. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. For listening, for thinking, for letting these stories carry you somewhere quiet. There is more in here than we covered tonight. There always is. That is what makes it worth coming back to. If you liked this, the like button is right there. If you want to be around for the next one, subscribe. Sleep well. See you in the wasteland. Part 23. The machines that outlasted their masters. Robots, automatrons, and the long memory of pre-war automation. One of the stranger threads running through the Fallout universe is the condition of its automated systems. Robots were everywhere in pre-war America. Mr. Handy units in homes, Protectrons in stores and police stations, Mr. Gutsy models in military applications, Securitrons on contract to various law enforcement agencies, sentry bots guarding sensitive facilities. And these machines, built for a world that no longer exists, have continued operating in the ruins of that world for 200 years, following their original programming with varying degrees of success and coherence. The Protectrons in Diamond City, who still enforce noise ordinances in a settlement that has been a functioning post-war community for decades, are not malfunctioning. They are doing exactly what they were programmed to do. The problem is that the context for that programming is gone, and the machines cannot update their understanding of what their programming means without input from owners and authorities who are dead. So they enforce noise ordinances. They warn citizens about jaywalking. They continue to maintain a version of pre-war civic order that has no relationship to the actual social dynamics of the settlement they are nominally policing. The Miss Nanny robots in the memory den in Good Neighbor, who tend to the physical bodies of clients while those clients are experiencing memory playback in the den's chairs, are performing a function that is recognizable and appropriate to their programming, even in a post-war context. They are caretakers. They have found a context where that function still makes sense, which is more than most pre-war robots managed. The automatrons who appear in the Far Harbor DLC's Acadia settlement, reprogrammed and maintained by the synth community there, represent another successful adaptation. Machines that were built for one purpose and have been given another by the new context they find themselves in. The Rust Devils Raider faction in Fallout 4's Automatron DLC have taken a different approach to the machines. They have incorporated robotic components into their own bodies and their culture, treating the merger of human and machine as a form of power. This is a specific post-war adaptation that the original robots were not designed to enable, but that the availability of robot components and the specific culture of the Rust Devils produced anyway. The Mechanist, the antagonist of the Automatron DLC, is a different case. A person who built an elaborate fiction about protecting the Commonwealth by deploying robots, without fully processing that the robot's threat assessment protocols were not working as intended. The story is about the specific problem of a person who has isolated themselves with their work for long enough that the feedback loop of reality has stopped reaching them. The RoboBrains, the particularly unsettling enemy type that appears in multiple games, are a category that sits at the uncomfortable intersection of machine and person. They are mechanical bodies housing actual human brains, preserved in a dome of fluid and connected to the robotic systems that house them. The original rationale for this design was that human brains provided specific cognitive capabilities that early artificial intelligence systems could not replicate, and that building a robot around a preserved brain was more efficient than trying to replicate those capabilities in code. The ethical dimension of this, the question of what the brain inside a robo-brain experiences, and whether it experiences anything at all, is addressed in the lore with the specific hedging that characterizes the franchise's approach to consciousness questions. The brains were taken from consenting volunteers, or from prisoners, or from people who were already dead, depending on which facility you are reading about, and whether any of those categories resolves the ethical question is not something the lore resolves. The protectrons at Poseidon energy facilities throughout the capital wasteland are still following their original security protocols, still treating anyone who enters the facility as a potential unauthorized visitor who needs to be challenged and potentially removed. They have done this for 200 years. The facilities they are protecting have been closed and empty for most of that time. The specific institutional logic of their programming has continued executing long after the institution it was meant to serve has ceased to exist. This is, in a small way, the same dynamic that characterizes the Enclave. An institutional logic built for specific conditions that continues operating after those conditions are gone, that cannot update itself to account for the changed reality, because updating would require acknowledging that what it was built to protect no longer exists. The memory of machines in the Fallout universe is, in certain respects, more reliable than the memory of people. The machines have their programming. They do what they were built to do. Within the limits of their mechanical maintenance, they do not forget. They do not revise. They do not build elaborate ideological frameworks to justify deviations from their original function. They are what they were built to be, in conditions that their builders never imagined, executing instructions that were written for a world that burned 200 years ago. There is something in this that speaks to one of the franchise's deepest preoccupations. The world that ended on October 23, 2077, left an enormous amount of physical evidence behind. The buildings and the cars and the robots and the terminal entries and the holotapes and the skeletons and the photographs and the Nuka-Cola machines and the protectrons still enforcing noise ordinances in Diamond City. All of it is still there, still doing what it was built to do or what it was placed to do, still serving as evidence of a world that no longer exists. The wasteland is an enormous archive. The hardest thing to find in it is not the weapons or the caps or the power armor. It is the understanding of what the archive is actually saying. That requires patience and attention, and the willingness to sit with stories that do not have resolutions, with questions that do not have answers, with the specific emotional weight of inhabiting the ruins of something that was, however badly, genuinely human. That is the Fallout universe. That is why people keep coming back to it, keep exploring its margins, keep reading its terminal entries, keep assembling its history from scattered evidence, the way an archaeologist assembles a picture of a lost civilization from shards. Because the civilization is not quite lost. It is right here in the ruins. It is still talking. You just have to know how to listen. Thank you for spending tonight here. For every one of you who made it to the end, who followed the whole thread from the pre-war history to the Vault experiments, to the Great War, to the factions and the synths, and the Dunwich horror, and the cut content, and the hidden stories and the robots still keeping vigil in, empty buildings, this was made for you. If this gave you something, a like costs nothing and means more than you might think. Subscribe and you will get more of this when there is more to tell. There is always more to tell. Take care of yourselves out there. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. Closing reflection. The war that never changes and the world that keeps changing. There is a line that has opened every Fallout game since the original. You know it. War. War never changes. The specific cadence of those words, spoken in Ron Perlman's voice over footage of nuclear apocalypse and mid-century Americana, has become one of gaming's most recognizable pieces of audio shorthand, and like most very familiar things, it rewards thinking about rather than simply receiving. The claim is not obviously true. Wars have changed enormously over the course of human history, in their weapons and their logistics and their political organization, and the populations they involve, and the consequences they produce. The history of warfare is, in many respects, precisely a history of change. So what does the line actually mean? The reading that the franchise ultimately supports is specific. War's instruments change, but its causes do not. The resource wars that preceded the Great War were fought over oil, which is a specific fuel with a specific supply curve and a specific geopolitical distribution. But the underlying driver, competition for resources that are scarcer than the competing parties' demands for them, is not new. It is not unique to the 21st century of Fallout's alternate history. It is the same thing that has driven conflict across the entire span of recorded human history, and the nuclear weapons that made the Great War possible are simply the most efficient instruments ever developed for that perennial human project. The wasteland that results from the Great War is, in a sense, the most honest possible expression of what happens when that project reaches its logical conclusion. When the competition for resources is pursued without limit, when the weapons are good enough to actually end things rather than simply damage them, when the institutional frameworks that normally moderate the worst competitive impulses collapse or are deliberately dismantled, you get the world of Fallout. A world where the resources that everyone was competing for are largely gone, where the infrastructure that made those resources valuable is destroyed, where the people who survived are starting from near zero with whatever they managed to salvage. And then, 200 years later, the same competition is starting again. The NCR competes with Caesar's Legion for control of the Mojave's resources. Different factions compete for Hoover Dam's power generation. The Brotherhood competes with the Institute for Technological Supremacy in the Commonwealth. The Raiders compete with the settlers for whatever there is to have. The war never changed because the underlying dynamic of competition for scarce resources never changed, just the scale of the weapons available for prosecuting it. The Fallout universe does not offer a solution to this. It is not ultimately a franchise with a message about how to fix the human tendency toward violent competition. It is a franchise that looks at that tendency clearly, without flinching and without romanticizing, and presents it in a setting where the consequences of following it to its endpoint are literally everywhere. The wasteland is the message. You are walking through the answer to the question of what happens if you let that tendency run without limit. Everything you see is evidence. This is why the franchise's best content is always the content that connects the specific, individual human stories to the larger institutional and historical context. Randall Clark's holotapes are not just about Randall Clark. They are about what a person can do within a catastrophe that was not their fault and that they cannot reverse. About what meaningful action looks like when the scale of what has happened dwarfs any individual's capacity to address it. The Vault experiments are not just about cruelty for its own sake. They are about the specific logic of institutions that have decided that their goals justify their means, that the suffering of individuals is an acceptable cost for the information or the advantage those institutions are seeking. The Dunwich horror is not just atmospheric dressing. It is a suggestion that the most frightening things in the Fallout universe are not the ones that were created by human decisions, not the super mutants and the radiation and the nuclear devastation, but the ones that were there before any of that predate the civilization that destroyed itself and will outlast whatever the wasteland eventually produces. The franchise has been asking the same questions for nearly 30 years. across multiple development teams and multiple entries and a television series, and an enormous community of players who have collectively assembled more understanding of this world than any individual playthrough could contain. The questions have not been answered, not because the franchise is withholding answers, but because the questions are not the kind that have answers. They are the kind that reward continued asking. That is the Fallout universe. That is what is worth spending time within it. Not just the guns and the VATs and the building systems and the faction choices, though all of those are genuinely good. The asking. The continued attention to a world that keeps revealing more of itself the more closely you look at it. There is always more of the wasteland left to walk through. A final word on the lore community. No discussion of Fallout's theories and secrets is complete without acknowledging the people who actually find them. The Fallout community's relationship to the franchise's lore is one of the more remarkable collective projects in gaming. Over nearly 3 decades, players with varying degrees of technical skill, ranging from casual readers who notice an interesting terminal entry, to dedicated data miners who extract and analyze the game's underlying files, have assembled a picture of the Fallout universe that is substantially more comprehensive than what any individual developer team intended any individual player to reach. The community finds things the developers put in deliberately. It finds things the developers put in without being entirely sure anyone would find. And occasionally it finds things that the developers themselves are surprised by, consequences of interactions between systems that were built independently and that produce emergent behavior that no one planned. The culture of sharing those discoveries, of building on each other's findings, of building wiki entries and Reddit threads and YouTube video essays that extend and contextualize what has been found, is a genuine collaborative intellectual project conducted by millions of people who love a franchise and want to understand it more completely. This is part of what makes the deliberate ambiguities in the Fallout lore work as well as they do. The question of who fired first, the synth soul survivor theory, the Dunwich thread, all of these thrive in an ecosystem where people are paying close enough attention to notice the clues and care enough to discuss what the clues might mean. The developers know that their work will be read this carefully. Some of what they build is specifically designed for that level of reading, details that are not accessible to casual play but that are meaningful when found by people who are looking. The Fallout Lore Wiki, maintained by a large community of contributors, contains more documented information about the franchise's canonical history than any official source. It cross-references terminal entries from different games to build coherent timelines. It tracks the movements of factions across centuries of post-war history. It notes inconsistencies and proposes possible resolutions. It is, in its way, the closest thing the franchise has to a unified document of its own history, and it is built by people who care enough to build it without compensation, who are doing it because the world is interesting enough to deserve the work. That collective project is part of the Fallout experience now, as much as the games themselves. The conversation that the community is having about the franchise, the theories it generates and tests and revises, the discoveries it makes and shares, is part of the living reality of the Fallout universe. The world keeps expanding. The questions keep generating new questions. And somewhere, right now, someone is reading a terminal entry in a corner of the wasteland that most players walk past, and they are finding something that nobody else has found yet. And they are about to share it with everyone else who loves this franchise and wants to know what it means. That is the Fallout community doing what it does. And it is, in its specific way, exactly what the franchise has always asked for. Patient attention, willingness to read everything, and the understanding that the most interesting things are usually not the most obvious ones. The wasteland keeps its secrets carefully, but it always leaves enough clues to find them.